Snow over London, December the 31st, 1926. The wind picks at chimney smoke and rattles a loose pane in the back room of Wool's orphanage. A woman has come to the door, soaked through and barely standing. She does not give her real name. By the time the matron has wrapped her in a blanket and put the kettle on the hob, she is already in labour. Tonight, we follow that child. We follow him through 8 decades and 2 wars, through the corridors of a school he loved more than any home he ever had, through the long hollow years when he was nothing but smoke, and into the dawn of May the 2nd, 1998, when a single deflected curse ended him on the flagstones of the Great Hall at Hogwarts. His name when he was born was Tom Marvolo Riddle. The name he chose for himself, after years of careful design, was Lord Voldemort. This will take time. Pour yourself something warm if you would like. Loosen anything tight. Settle into whatever surface is holding you, and let your breathing slow to match the pace of the words. There is no hurry here. We have the whole night. Anne, if you like this kind of stuff, don't be shy and hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell for more updates. Let's get moving. The story moves year by year. Some of those years are loud, full of war and headlines and bodies pulled from rubble. Others are quiet, almost empty. The kind of years that feel like nothing is happening, even while a man is making the very choices that will doom him later. Both kinds matter. The quiet years are where the rot grows. We begin where Tom himself began, with a family he never met, and a country house that had been falling apart for generations before he was born. A village in the English Midlands called Little Hangleton, a shack at the edge of a wood, 3 people inside it, holding the bloodline of Salazar Slytherin in their hands as if it were a relic, and slowly ruining it with their own. Part 1. The Gaunt inheritance. The shack stood in a hollow below the manor house. From the village road you would not have seen it. You would have seen the great gabled roof of the Riddle estate at the top of the hill, the lawns clipped, the gravel raked, the windows clean. To find the Gaunts you would have had to leave the road, push through the high grass, follow a path so faint it was really only a memory of a path, and then keep going until you smelled the smoke. Even then, you might have walked past it. The trees had grown so close to the building that the chimney shared a wall with an oak. Nettles crowded the doorstep. A snake had been nailed to the front door, dead but recent, drying in the air. The man who lived inside that house was named Marvolo Gaunt. He was the last patriarch of what had once been a great wizarding family. His ancestors had owned half the parish. They had ridden in carriages and gone to coronations. They had married into other old houses and sat in Wizengamot chairs. By the time Marvolo inherited what was left, the family had spent every coin of its fortune and burned every bridge it ever crossed. What remained of the Gaunts was this: 2 rooms, a floor of beaten earth, a roof that leaked when it rained, and in the corner of the kitchen, hung from a nail by a length of black ribbon, a small gold locket that Marvolo wore around his neck whenever he wanted to feel important. That locket had belonged to Salazar Slytherin. There was no doubt about it. The serpentine S inlaid in the metal was the founder's own mark, and any wizard who had ever opened a book on the founders could identify it on sight. Whether Marvolo understood the object's real value is another question. He understood that it made him better than other men. He understood that it could be polished and brandished. He did not understand, or did not care to understand, that he was wearing on a string around his neck one of the most powerful pieces of magical history in the British Isles. He treated it the way a poor man treats a wedding ring he refuses to sell, with pride and with neglect. On his hand he wore a second relic, a heavy gold ring set with a single black stone. The stone was old in a way that ordinary stones are not. A small symbol had been carved into its face. Marvolo claimed that the ring had belonged to the family for centuries, that the mark on the stone was the Peverell coat of arms. He was correct on both counts, though he understood almost nothing about what the ring really was. To him it was proof of pedigree, Anne, something he could shove into the face of any stranger who walked through his door before he turned them out into the rain. There were 2 other people in that house, a son and a daughter. The son's name was Morfin. He was somewhere in his 20s when our story properly begins, but he looked older. He looked like something that had been left out in the weather. His hair grew in patches, his teeth were broken. He spoke very little English. What he did speak fluently was Parseltongue, the language of serpents, which was the only family inheritance the Gaunts had managed not to spend. Morfin used it to talk to snakes. Anne. He used it because he liked snakes more than he liked people, and because he had grown up in a house where his father considered every other human being an inferior creature. The daughter's name was Merope. She was the youngest. We do not know exactly when she was born. We do not know what her childhood looked like. We know what it produced. A woman in her late teens or early 20s with stringy hair and a thin face and eyes that always seemed to be looking somewhere over your shoulder. She wore rags. She moved through the shack like a person who had been taught very young that to be seen was to be punished. She did the cooking and the cleaning and the mending. She fetched the water. She was beaten when she dropped a plate. She was beaten when the soup was cold. She was beaten when Marvolo decided, looking at her across the table, that her eyes did not focus the way a proper Gaunt's eyes should focus. Merope was a witch. She was a Gaunt and a direct descendant of Slytherin. She carried in her blood the same magical inheritance that her father and her brother carried, but years of fear had hollowed her out. Magic in our world is not a tap you turn on with a wand, Anne. It is something inside you, something that responds to feeling, something that strengthens when you are sure of yourself and falters when you are not. By the time she was a grown woman, Merope had not been sure of herself for a single hour of her life. Her magic was so weak that her father called her a squib. He used the word as an insult. He used it as if squibs were vermin. He did not seem to notice or care that he was calling his own daughter the slur he reserved for the worst of muggles. On a midsummer day in 1925, two strangers came up the path. The first was a ministry official named Bob Ogden, sent from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The second was Morfin's victim, a young man on horseback, a muggle, the son of the family that owned the manor at the top of the hill. His name was Tom Riddle. He was 23 years old, fair-haired, well-dressed, and entirely unaware that he had ever met a wizard. He had been riding down the lane with a young woman named Cecilia when Morfin, hidden in the undergrowth, had jinxed him. Tom had broken out in welts. Morfin had laughed. Anne. Tom had reported it to nobody but his fiancée, who had been frightened, and so the affair would have ended there. But Morfin had performed the jinx in front of a muggle, and that meant the ministry came. What happened in the shack that afternoon is on ministry record. Bob Ogden wrote it up in his report, and his memory of the visit was later extracted as evidence and preserved. Marvolo Gaunt screamed at the ministry man. He held up the locket and the ring and shouted about his lineage. Morfin, in Parseltongue, declared that he had jinxed the muggle and would do it again. Merope, the daughter, fetched and dropped and fetched again, and when Marvolo discovered her staring out of the window at the muggle boy on the road, he turned on her and beat her in front of strangers. Ogden tried to intervene. Marvolo screamed at him to get out. By the end of the visit, it was clear that both Gaunt men were going to be taken in. The charges were assault and exposure of magic to a muggle. They were arrested. They were dragged off to Azkaban. Morfin was given a short sentence. Marvolo was given a slightly longer one. The shack was empty. Or rather, the shack was almost empty. There was still one person inside it. There was still Merope. For the first time in her life, she was alone in that house, with nobody to beat her, nobody to scream at her, nobody to call her a squib in front of strangers. She had been a prisoner for as long as she could remember. The cage door had swung open, and the very first thing she did with her freedom was reach for the muggle boy who had ridden past on horseback, the one who had unknowingly broken her. She had been watching him for years, from the corner of the kitchen window, from the lane when she went down to draw water. She had built a whole life around his face. He did not know she existed. He was engaged to Cecilia. He was by all accounts a snob, a vain young man who looked down on the villagers and would never, in any version of any future, have looked twice at the strange wild creature who lived in the hollow. So she made him look. We do not know exactly what method she used. It may have been a love potion, brewed from one of the few books her family still owned. It may have been the Imperious Curse, though that would have required more confident magic than she had ever shown. Whatever it was, it worked. Anne. Within weeks, the village was talking about young Tom Riddle and a girl from the wrong side of the hill. He had broken off the engagement with Cecilia. He had taken up with a tramp. Within a few months, he had married her. Within a year, they were both gone. He had taken her to London because he could not bear the gossip in Little Hangleton, and because he was, by then, completely besotted in the chemically managed way that the besotted under a potion always are. What Merope wanted from him she got: a small flat, a roof, a surname, and, eventually, a child growing in her body. She was happy in those months. We can guess at this, because of what she did next. She was happy enough to believe, finally, that he loved her. She convinced herself that what had begun with a potion had become real. She stopped giving him the dose. It is the saddest decision in this entire story. It is the moment that the rest of the tragedy turns on. Anne. If she had kept giving him the potion, she would have kept him. Anne. He would have stayed her husband. The baby would have grown up in a London flat with 2 parents and a name, and the wizarding world would have unfolded down some other line. She wanted him to love her without the spell. She wanted him to choose her, so she stopped. And within days, he had looked at her properly for the first time in nearly a year, and he had seen what he had married, and he had walked out. He went back to Little Hangleton, to his parents' house at the top of the hill, to the life he was supposed to have had. He told anyone who would listen that the girl had hoodwinked him, that he had been out of his right mind, that he was now restored. The village mostly believed him, mostly. Some of the older women, the ones who had seen Merope grow up and had wondered about her, kept their opinions to themselves. Merope stayed in the flat through the autumn of 1926. The pregnancy was further along by then. She had no money, she had no family she could go back to. Morfin was in Azkaban. Marvolo had died there earlier that same year, of nothing in particular, of being the kind of man who could not live without an audience to despise. The shack was empty, and the ministry would not have given Merope back its key. So she stayed in London, and she sold what she had. She had the Slytherin locket. Anne. She had carried it out of the shack the day her father was arrested. She walked into Nocturne Alley with the locket in her hand, and she walked into Borgin and Burke's, the curiosity dealers, the buyers of dark and old things. The man behind the counter that day was named Caractacus Burke. He was a haggler. He was looking at a starving girl with stringy hair and a swollen belly, and he saw a locket of obviously old gold, with an obviously meaningful S etched into the surface, and he offered her 10 galleons. 10 galleons for the heirloom of Salazar Slytherin. He knew exactly what he was doing. She knew, somewhere underneath the hunger and the cold, that the price was an insult. She took it anyway. She had nothing else. The galleons did not last. They never do. Some weeks later, on the last day of December in 1926, a young woman in a wet coat stumbled up the steps of Wool's orphanage on a side street in London. She rang the bell. She would not give her name. The matron, a young Mrs. Cole, opened the door. The girl was already in labour. They put her in a back room and they sent for the doctor, and the doctor came too late. The baby was born just before midnight on the 31st. The mother lived perhaps an hour longer, just long enough to say what she wanted him to be called. She said his name should be Tom, after his father. She said his middle name should be Marvolo, after her own father. She said his surname should be Riddle, Tran. She said the words, "I hope he looks like his papa," which were the last words anyone in this world ever heard Merope Gaunt speak. She closed her eyes. She did not open them, and Mrs. Cole wrapped the baby in a clean cloth and carried him upstairs to a cot in the nursery, where he joined the other infants and children of Wool's, 20 or so of them, in the only home he would have until he was 11 years old. That is how Tom Riddle came into the world, with a dead mother, an absent father, a name he hated almost from the first moment he understood it, and an inheritance he would not learn about for years. The locket was in Borgin and Burke's. The ring was on the hand of his uncle, Morfin, who had collected it from the floor of the shack when he came back from Azkaban. The shack itself was crumbling in the hollow below the Riddle estate, and up the hill, in the manor house, Tom Riddle Sr. was eating his dinner. He did not know that he was a father. He never would. Before we move on, a small thing. Anne, if this is your first night falling asleep with one of these long stories, leave a comment that just says Night 1. If you have been here before, Tell us in the comments how many nights you have been keeping company with us, Anne. It helps the channel more than you might guess, and it tells us which corners of the wizarding world to visit next. If you have been enjoying the pace of the narration, a quiet like is appreciated. Now, back to the orphanage. Part 2. The orphanage years 1927 to 1938 Wool's Orphanage was a tall grey building on the side of a London street that had once been respectable and was no longer respectable. The brick was soot-stained. The windows on the upper floors did not all close properly. Inside, the corridors smelled of carbolic soap and cabbage. The matron was a young woman called Mrs. Cole, who was new to the post when Tom arrived, and who would stay long enough to see him leave again at 11, looking back at her over his shoulder from the doorway with eyes she would describe, much later, as not quite a child's eyes. In the first years, there is not much to tell. He was a baby, and then he was a toddler, and then he was a small boy in a grey smock, sitting on the floor of a nursery that contained perhaps 24 other children at any given time. The orphanage was full, because the previous decade had emptied a great many homes. Spanish influenza had taken parents, the Great War had taken fathers. The slow grey famine of an industrial city had taken the rest. The children who lived at Wool's were the children that London had not been able to fit anywhere else, and Tom was one of them. And at first nothing about him looked particularly remarkable. He spoke late. When he began to speak, he spoke in full sentences. He did not babble, he did not stumble. He waited until he was sure of the word he wanted, and then he produced it, and the adults around him remarked on it. He was clever, everybody said so. He had an enormous capacity for retaining what he was told, and a thin, clear voice, and the kind of stillness in his face that older children rarely have. The other infants at Wool's would cry when they wanted something. Tom watched the adults first, Anne. He watched until he understood which kinds of expressions produced which kinds of responses. And then he produced those expressions himself. He was never punished for crying, because he had stopped crying when crying did not seem to work, Anne. By the time he was 4 or 5 years old, the other children at the orphanage had begun to keep away from him. We do not have a single piece of evidence that he had ever struck any of them in those early years. He did not need to. He had developed, almost as soon as he could walk, a way of looking at another child, and producing in that child a feeling of cold dread. Mrs. Cole, who saw this for years, did not have a word for it. She would only say that there was something not quite right about little Tom, something behind the eyes. The other children gave him a wider berth than they gave anyone else in the building, Anne. They did not want to share his room. They did not want to share his end of the dinner table. When he came near them at games in the yard, they drifted away as if a wind had picked up. He had begun to do things he could not have explained, even to himself. Small things at first. A spoon would slide across the table toward his hand when he was hungry. A locked drawer would click open in the night when he had wanted to see what was inside it. A bigger boy, who had pushed him down on the staircase, tripped and fell down the same staircase a week later and broke an arm, and could not afterwards say how it had happened. None of this looked like magic to the people watching. It looked like luck, or like coincidence, or like a strangely fortunate child who never seemed to lose. Mrs. Cole noticed because she noticed everything. She did not say anything because she did not have any framework in which to say it. Then came the rabbit. A boy named Billy Stubbs lived at Wool's. Billy Stubbs was older than Tom by a year or two and bigger, and like many older, bigger boys, he had developed a small territorial cruelty toward the younger ones. He had a rabbit. He kept it in a hutch in the yard. He doted on it the way a child dotes on a thing he can own without being told to share. Tom and Billy had quarrelled. The exact nature of the quarrel was never quite established. Anne. What happened next was simply that the rabbit was found one morning hanging from the rafters of the orphanage attic, by its neck, from a length of cord. Nobody in the building could explain how the rabbit had gotten up there. Billy had locked the hutch the night before. The doors had been bolted. The cord was the kind that nobody at Wool's used. The body was cold, the body was small. Mrs. Cole stood in the attic doorway and looked at it for a long time. Then she went downstairs and asked Tom if he had been in the attic that night. Tom told her no. He said it without hesitating. He said it without blinking. She had no way to prove otherwise. The matter was closed because there was no way to open it. Billy was given a different rabbit some weeks later. He never spoke to Tom again, and nobody encouraged him to. There was an outing the following summer. Wools took the children to the seaside once a year, to a small village on the south coast, where the orphanage rented a guest house and the children were allowed onto the beach. Two of the smaller children were named Amy Benson and Dennis Bishop. They were timid, Anne. They did not have parents, and they did not particularly have friends. Tom seemed to take an interest in them on that trip. He spoke to them softly. He told them he wanted to show them something, Anne. He led them away from the rest of the group, down the beach, along a path the others did not know, to a cave in the rocks where the tide pooled and the air was cold. What happened in that cave, neither child would ever say. They would not speak about it. Even years later, even pressed gently by adults, even bribed with sweets, they would not say. They came out of the cave white-faced and shaking. They were quiet for weeks afterward. Amy Benson developed a stutter that lasted into her teens. Dennis Bishop began to wet the bed again at the age of 8. Both of them flinched when Tom came into a room. Mrs. Cole asked Tom, when they got back to London, what had happened in the cave. Tom told her nothing had happened. He looked her in the eye when he said it. He said it the way a person who has practiced lying says a sentence he has already said in his head a dozen times. By his 10th year, Tom had developed a small habit. He liked to take things from the other children. Not anything that the staff would notice missing, small things, a toy soldier, a yo-yo, a handkerchief with a stitched initial in the corner. He kept them in a box under his bed. They were trophies. We know about the box because Mrs. Cole found it later, when she was clearing out his room for the next child to use. There were perhaps 20 objects in it, and she recognized most of them as belongings of children who had at one time or another been afraid of Tom Riddle. He had learned by then that he could do things on purpose, not just at moments of stress, not just when he was angry or hungry or cornered. He could make objects move when he wanted to. He could speak to snakes in the orphanage garden, and they answered him. Though he did not yet understand that this was unusual, he could make himself feel calm by feeling cold things in the other person's face. He could hurt other children without lifting a hand. He kept these abilities secret because secrecy was the first lesson he had ever taught himself. He did not know the word magic. He did not know there were others like him. He believed, for those early years, that he was simply special, the way a young god might be special, born better than the people around him, surrounded by lesser creatures who could not be expected to understand. In the summer of 1938, when Tom was 11.5 years old, an unexpected visitor came to Wools. He was an extremely tall man with auburn hair and a long auburn beard, dressed in a plum-coloured velvet suit that was, by the standards of London in 1938, alarming. He sat in Mrs. Cole's office and drank a glass of gin with her, which is one of the few times in any record of his life that Albus Dumbledore is known to have drunk a glass of gin with anyone. Mrs. Cole did most of the talking. She wanted finally to tell someone about Tom. She told him about Billy's rabbit. She told him about the cave at the seaside. She told him about the silence in the dining hall when Tom came in. She had never spoken about any of it before, because nobody had ever asked. Dumbledore listened. When she was finished, he asked to be taken upstairs. The boy in the upstairs bedroom was small for his age. He sat on the edge of the bed with his feet flat on the floor and his hands folded in his lap. He had black hair, smoothed and neatly parted. His clothes were too small for him. His eyes were very dark. He watched Dumbledore come into the room, and he watched Dumbledore sit down opposite him, and he did not say hello, and he did not stand, and he did not move his hands. He waited to see what this strange tall man was going to do. Dumbledore told him, in the gentle way that Dumbledore told everyone everything, that there was a school he had been accepted to attend, and a school for people like him, people who could do the kinds of things he had been doing. Tom did not believe it at first. He thought it was a trick. He had been waiting his whole short life for some kind of adult to come and try to take him away to an institution, and he had a story prepared for if that should ever happen. And the story was that he was perfectly well and had nothing wrong with him and was not interested in anyone's help. He told Dumbledore as much. Dumbledore did not argue. He simply pointed his wand at the cheap wooden wardrobe in the corner of the room, and the wardrobe burst into flame. It was not real fire, nothing in the wardrobe burned, but the boy on the bed sat up very straight, and his eyes widened, and for the first time in the entire conversation, an expression that was not calculation crossed his face. It was hunger. It was something close to awe. He understood then that the tall man could actually do what he claimed, and that he, Tom, had been right his whole life, and that what he had been doing in private had a name and a structure and a tradition, and there was a school for it, and he was going. Dumbledore put the wardrobe out with a flick of the wand. He told the boy that there were rules. There were rules at the school about how magic was to be used, and rules about behavior, and rules about respect for staff and other students. He told the boy that he had heard there were certain items in a box under the bed that did not belong to Tom. He suggested that the items be returned to their owners with apologies. He used the word stealing for the first time, and Tom flinched, very slightly, in a way that any other adult would not have noticed. Dumbledore noticed everything. Tom retrieved the box from under the bed. Dumbledore watched him do it. Neither of them spoke. Tom understood in those silent seconds that this tall man with the auburn beard had measured him already and had found something, somewhere, that he did not approve of, and would be watching from a great distance for the rest of Tom's life. It was the first time anyone in Tom's life had ever looked at him with skepticism. He hated it. He hated Dumbledore from that moment onward. He hated him for 60 years. He would never, until the very last day of his life, stop hating him. But he did not show it. He smiled. Anne. He thanked the professor. He said he would be ready for the train at the end of the summer. He said all the right things in the right order, in the careful, clear voice that Mrs. Cole had been describing to people for a decade. And Dumbledore went away with the impression that the boy was extraordinary and dangerous and possibly already past saving. A few weeks later, Tom went with Dumbledore to Diagon Alley. Dumbledore had argued in the staff room that the boy ought to have an escort on his first trip into the wizarding world. Privately, he had decided he wanted to watch the boy in a setting full of strangers. He wanted to see how Tom behaved when other wizarding children were nearby. He wanted, perhaps, to be sure that what he had seen at Wolves was not simply an artifact of an unkind upbringing. They went to Gringotts, and they went to Madame Malkin's for robes, and they went to Flourish and Blots for books. Anne. Tom did not touch anything he was not invited to touch. He thanked everyone he was supposed to thank. He memorized the layout of the street as he walked. He looked, for everyone else in Diagon Alley that afternoon, exactly like a well-behaved, muggle-raised child being shown the world for the first time. Dumbledore watched him out of the corner of his eye and was not reassured. The wand they bought him came from Ollivander's. Mr. Ollivander himself fitted it. Tom went through a long row of unsuitable wands, growing visibly more impatient with each rejection, until Ollivander produced a wand of yew, 13.5 inches long, with a core of phoenix feather. The phoenix in question had given only one other feather. That feather, decades later, would go into a different wand, which would belong to a boy with a scar. We will get to him. For now, what matters is that Tom Riddle picked up the yew wand, and the wand picked him back, and a small wind ruffled the parchment on the shop counter, and Ollivander, who had seen many wand pairings in his life, gave him a slow, careful look, and did not say what he was thinking. He charged 7 galleons. The money came from a Hogwarts fund for students whose families could not pay. Tom took the wand and carried it out of the shop, holding it as if he had been waiting his whole life to feel it in his hand, which, in a sense, he had. And, on the 1st of September 1938, an 11-year-old boy in shabby second-hand robes pushed a trolley through the barrier at King's Cross Station and stepped onto platform 9 3/4 for the first time. Anne. He did not have parents to wave him off. He did not have brothers or sisters at the other end of the platform. He had a small trunk with a borrowed cauldron in it and a yew wand in his pocket. He looked at the scarlet train. He looked at the steam. Anne. He looked at the other children, the ones with proper families, the ones whose mothers were straightening their robes and pressing biscuits into their hands. He did not stare. He looked. Anne. And then he climbed aboard the Hogwarts Express and went to find an empty compartment, alone, where he could think. Part 3. Hogwarts, 1938 to 1945. The first time Tom Riddle saw Hogwarts, he saw it from the boat. The first-year students at Hogwarts have always crossed the lake by water at night, with the lanterns at the bow and the castle towering up out of the cliff in front of them. And for almost every child who has ever made that crossing, the sight of the castle has been the sight of a fairy tale come to life. For Tom, it was something different. He saw the castle and he understood, with a clarity that he could never quite explain to anyone, that this was where he had always been supposed to live. The orphanage had been the mistake. The first 11 years of his life had been the mistake. The castle was the correction. He was sorted into Slytherin. The hat barely touched his head. Anne. He sat down at the green-trimmed table on the far side of the great hall, between two older boys, whose names he had already learned from the train, and he looked up at the ceiling, where the floating candles hung and the night sky moved as if the roof did not exist. He looked at the staff table. He looked at the headmaster, an old wizard named Armando Dippet, and he made a mental note that this was the man he would need to charm. He looked at the deputy headmaster, who at that time was a younger man named Galatea Merrythought, and he made a mental note of her too. He looked at the auburn-haired transfiguration master at the end of the table, and his face did not change. Dumbledore looked back at him over the heads of the other staff, and his face did not change either. It is sometimes said that Tom Riddle was a popular student. This is not quite right. Anne. He was a respected student, which is a different thing. From the very first week, he made it his business to know who was who. He knew which of his housemates had old wizarding surnames. He knew which of the staff were sentimental and which were strict. Anne. He knew the layout of the castle better than most fourth years, because he walked the corridors at night when everyone else was in bed, and he learned the patterns of the staircases and the moving portraits and the patrolling ghosts. By Christmas of his first year, he had made allies of every Slytherin prefect by the simple device of being useful to them. He fetched books from the library. He carried notes between common rooms. Anne. He listened very attentively when the older students complained, and he remembered everything they said. His classwork was perfect. Not merely excellent, perfect. He did not get the highest mark in his year by half a point. He got the highest mark by a clear margin in every subject he took. The other students noticed. The teachers noticed. The teachers loved him for it. Headmaster Dippet was particularly fond of him, in the absent-minded fashion of headmasters who are too busy to look closely. Professor Slughorn, the potions master and head of Slytherin, was fond of him in a more practical way. Slughorn collected students. He liked to be surrounded by clever young people whom he might one day call on for favours. Anne. He saw immediately that Tom was the most promising student he had taught in years, and he began to invite him to the small evening gatherings he held in his office. Anne. Tom went to those gatherings, and he listened to the older boys, and he watched Slughorn pour wine, and he learned everything he could about the political shape of the wizarding world. Only one of the teachers refused to be charmed. Dumbledore taught Tom Transfiguration. Dumbledore was as polite to him as he was to every other student. He never accused him of anything. He never raised his voice. He never gave him a mark he had not earned. But he watched him. He set him slightly harder tasks than he set the rest of the class, and he watched how Tom solved them. He let small comments slip in passing about the importance of how one used one's gifts. Tom understood, with a child's resentment that he never grew out of, that Dumbledore had never trusted him and would never trust him, no matter how many awards he won, no matter how charming he became, no matter how perfectly he wore the prefect's badge. He filed that grievance away. He kept it warm. Years later, it would still be the second deepest hatred of his life, behind only his hatred of the father whose name he carried. In his second year, he began the project that would consume the rest of his time at Hogwarts. He went looking for his family. He spent his evenings in the library, going through the genealogies, going through the school records, going through the old wizarding registers that listed the famous and the noble pure-blood houses. He looked for the surname Riddle. He found nothing. There was no Riddle anywhere in the wizarding registers. There was no Tom Riddle who had ever attended Hogwarts. There was no Riddle on any pure-blood family tree. No Riddle who had ever sat in the Wizengamot. No riddle who had ever published a book on charms or potions or curses. The name was empty. It belonged, he understood, only to muggles. He had been lying to himself for 2 years about his father. He had told himself a story in which his father was a wizard who had loved his mother and been killed in some heroic accident before Tom was born. He had built the story in private, and he had told nobody. He took the story out of his head now, looked at it, and put it down. His father was a muggle. His father was alive, perhaps, somewhere. His father had not loved his mother. He carried his father's name and his father's blood and his father's face. He took a long, quiet look at his own reflection in the dormitory mirror that night, and he hated everything about it. He went to bed, and he did not sleep. The next year he tried a different angle. He went looking for his mother. He looked for the surname she had used, the surname her father had used, the one she had told the matron at Wool's as she was dying. Marvolo, Gaunt. He found Gaunt in the family registers. It was an old name. It was older than most. The Gaunts had been a noble pure-blood family, prominent in the medieval period, descended directly from one of the 4 founders of the school, from Salazar Slytherin himself. Tom read this in a quiet corner of the library on a winter afternoon. He sat very still for a long time. He read it again. He went on reading. He understood then what he was. Not a riddle, a Gaunt, a descendant of Slytherin, the last living heir of the bloodline of the founder of his own house. The Sorting Hat had not been kind to him by accident. Anne. He belonged in Slytherin in the deepest sense of the word, because Slytherin was his ancestor, because the very stones of the dungeons under the castle had been laid by a man whose blood ran in him. The thought was a kind of religious experience. Anne. He went back to the dormitory that evening different from the boy who had walked in that morning. He had a fact now. He had a place in the world. He had a reason that he was better than the children around him. He had been right all his life, and the proof was 1,000 years old. He kept the discovery to himself. He did not tell the staff. He did not tell Slughorn, who would certainly have made a fuss of it. Anne. He did not tell his housemates, though he knew they would have treated him with even more deference if he had. He held the secret like a coin in his pocket. He turned it over in private. He waited until he was ready to use it. In the spring of his 5th year, when he was 15 years old, he used it. There is a story that every Slytherin first year hears in some version. Anne. The story is that Salazar Slytherin, before he left the school in a quarrel with the other founders, built a hidden chamber somewhere within the castle. Anne. The chamber contained a creature loyal to Slytherin, and the creature could be released only by Slytherin's own true heir, and the heir would use the creature to purge the school of those students. Slytherin had not wanted there in the first place. The students born to Muggle parents. The students Slytherin had called mudbloods. Most of the children who heard this story half believed it for a few weeks, and then put it away as nonsense. Tom Riddle did not put it away. He believed it the moment he read it. Anne. He started looking for the chamber the day after he learned that the founders of Hogwarts had included his own great ancestor. He found it. We do not know exactly how. He never told anybody. He must have spent weeks, perhaps months, walking the corridors and tapping walls and trying combinations of Parseltongue against likely-looking carvings. He found the entrance in a girl's bathroom on the 2nd floor, behind a stone sink etched with a small serpent. The sink moved aside when he spoke to it in the language of snakes. Below it was a pipe wide enough for a person to slide down. Below the pipe was a tunnel. Below the tunnel was a chamber, larger than the Great Hall, with stone pillars carved as serpents, and at the far end of the chamber a vast stone statue of Salazar Slytherin himself, hundreds of feet tall, and inside the mouth of that statue, sleeping, was the basilisk. A basilisk is a serpent. It is enormous, the size of a tree trunk in girth, and many times the length of an ordinary snake. It can live for 1,000 years. Its venom is one of the most caustic substances known to magic. Its gaze in direct eye contact kills instantly. Through reflection in water or a mirror or a polished surface, the gaze petrifies. There is only one way to control a basilisk. You must be able to speak to it in Parseltongue. Tom could. He woke the basilisk. He did not tell it to kill anyone at first. He simply confirmed it was real. He went back many nights, and He came to understand the structure of the tunnel system that ran behind the walls of the castle. Anne. He learned that the pipes connected the chamber to every bathroom and washroom and drain in the school. Anne. He learned that the basilisk could travel anywhere inside the walls without ever being seen by the people walking the corridors above. He understood, slowly, what he had inherited. He understood that he could end any life in the school whenever he chose to. He chose to. The first death came in the spring of 1943. A girl named Myrtle Warren died in the second-floor girls' bathroom, the same one where the chamber's entrance was hidden. She was killed in a single moment by the eyes of the basilisk. She had not seen who was talking in the next stall. She had only heard a strange hissing language she did not recognize, and stepped out angry and met the gaze of an enormous yellow eye. She died standing up. There was no mark on her body. The Ministry of Magic was called. So was the headmaster. So were the parents of every Muggle-born student in the school, because the deaths and petrifications across that school year had been falling on Muggle-born students with a pattern too consistent to be accident. The school stood at the edge of being closed. It was not closed because Tom solved the problem. He did it deftly. He framed another student. The student in question was a third year named Rubeus Hagrid, a half-giant boy who kept dangerous creatures in the dormitories on a regular basis and made no secret of it, and who at that time was hiding under his bed a large acromantula spider that he called Aragog. Tom turned Hagrid in. He told the headmaster that Hagrid had been responsible for the attacks, that the monster was an acromantula, and that Hagrid had been letting it out at night to feed. The headmaster believed him. The ministry believed him. Hagrid was expelled, his wand snapped in front of the staff, and only the intervention of Dumbledore prevented him from being sent to Azkaban as well. Dumbledore had argued that Hagrid was too young and the evidence too thin. The argument bought Hagrid his life. It did not buy back his wand or his place at the school. And he was kept on as a groundskeeper, because Dumbledore would not allow him to be turned out altogether. He lived in the hut by the edge of the forest for the rest of his life. He never quite forgave the boy who had framed him. He never quite forgot. Tom received an award for special services to the school. The award was placed in the trophy room, engraved with the words TM, Riddle, and there it sat for 50 years, polished by generations of students given detention for one infraction or another. None of them ever knew Anne. Tom himself walked through the trophy room one evening near the end of his 5th year and stood for several minutes looking at his own name on the plaque. The chamber was closed. The basilisk was back in its sleep beneath the school. He had committed his first murder and had been thanked for it by the headmaster. He had also made his first Horcrux. A Horcrux, in the magical sense, is an object into which a wizard has placed a fragment of his own soul. The fragmentation is achieved by an act of murder. The soul of a wizard, in our world, is whole until the wizard kills someone, and the act of murder splits the soul. The wizard, who knows the spell and is willing to perform it after committing the murder, can take the loose fragment of his soul and seal it inside an object. So long as that object exists, the wizard cannot die, his body can be destroyed, his main soul will not pass on. It will remain in this world, tethered to the fragment in the object, and the body can in theory be remade. It is the oldest and darkest piece of magic in the entire surviving canon of European wizardry. It has been used in the historical record perhaps a dozen times. Most wizards who have tried it have been unable to live with themselves afterward and have undone the magic before its completion. The few who have succeeded have rarely made more than one Horcrux. The strain on the soul of even a single fragmentation is severe. To make several is to invite a degree of inner damage that most wizards consider self-evidently insane. Tom Riddle made his first Horcrux at the age of 16. He used the diary he had been writing in for years. He poured a fragment of his soul into it. He sealed the diary shut. He put it in the bottom of his trunk. He did not know yet that he would make 6 more. He had not yet decided on the number. He had only decided on the principle, Anne. He had decided that he was going to live forever, and that he was going to begin building the means of it now, Anne. The summer that followed, the summer of 1943, was the summer of his second Horcrux. He took the train back to London at the end of the school year, Anne. He stayed 2 weeks at Wolves, going through the motions of being an ordinary boy on holiday from school. Then he packed a small bag, and he walked out of the orphanage at 6 in the morning, and he caught a train north. He had been planning the trip for years. He went to the village of Little Hangleton. He had only one address. He had found it in the ministry's old criminal records, the ones that listed Bob Ogden's visit to the Gaunt shack. The address was the shack. It was where his uncle Morfin, released from Azkaban years before, still lived. Tom walked up the path to the shack on a hot July afternoon. The door was open. The snake on the lintel had been replaced with a fresh one. Morfin was sitting at the kitchen table eating bread. What happened in the shack that afternoon is partly known. Tom spoke to Morfin in Parseltongue. Morfin, who had not had a wizarding visitor in years, was startled. He took Tom for the boy he resembled, the young Tom Riddle from the manor up the hill, and the resemblance enraged him. Morfin shouted. He cursed his sister's name. He raved about how she had ruined the family by running off with a muggle. He told Tom, between mouthfuls of bread, exactly what had happened. The whole story. The love potion, the London flat, the abandonment, the pregnancy, the death. Tom listened to all of it. He listened to the last detail. And when Morfin had finished, Tom took Morfin's wand off the table, walked up the hill to the Riddle Manor, and went inside. He found his father and his father's parents at dinner. He killed all 3 of them with the killing curse, in the order they were sitting. His grandmother first, his grandfather second, his father last. None of them recognized him. None of them had ever heard of him. He stood over the bodies of 3 strangers who shared a name and a face with him, and he felt nothing. Anne. The local police would later find them stiff and unmarked, with terrified expressions, and the case would be unsolvable, because no Muggle pathologist had any idea what the killing curse looked like. He walked back to the shack. He returned Morfin's wand to the table. Anne. He used a memory charm on his uncle, so that Morfin would believe he had committed the murders himself and would confess accordingly. He took the heavy gold ring with the black stone from Morfin's finger, the one that had belonged to Marvolo, the one that had originally belonged to a wizard named Cadmus Peverell. He put it on his own. He walked back to the road and he caught the train south. By the time the ministry arrived to arrest Morfin, Tom Riddle was back in his bed at Wolves, having dinner with the matron downstairs. He turned the ring into his second Horcrux that autumn. He did it in the dormitory at Hogwarts in the small hours of the morning, with the curtains drawn around his bed. The stone in the ring darkened. The fragment of soul went into it. He hid the ring at the bottom of his trunk. He went down to breakfast the next morning and ate a perfectly ordinary plate of toast and eggs. In his 6th year, he asked Professor Slughorn the question that had been waiting on his lips since his 5th year. He chose the moment carefully. He waited until Slughorn was in a good mood after a slug club party, with a glass of mead in his hand and the candles low. He asked in a casual tone what Slughorn knew about Horcruxes. Slughorn turned a deep shade of red. He told Tom that the subject was not to be discussed at Hogwarts. He said it was very dark magic indeed. Tom apologized with elaborate sincerity. He said he had only read the word in passing in a library book. He said he was confused about what it meant. Slughorn, flattered to be asked and disarmed by the apology, told him a few sentences of the basic theory, badly, and then changed the subject. Then, Tom asked the only question he really wanted the answer to. He asked whether a wizard could split his soul not once, but more than once. Could it be done twice? Anne, could it be done 7 times? He picked the number 7, he said, because it was magically powerful. Slughorn looked at him with sudden naked alarm. Slughorn said that no wizard had ever been mad enough to do such a thing. Tom thanked him for his time and went up to bed. Slughorn would carry the memory of that conversation in his head for 50 years, ashamed of it, hiding it from himself, knowing on some level that he had told the boy the one thing the boy had needed to hear. In his 7th year, Tom was made head boy. He sat for his NEWTS in the spring and received the highest marks the examiners had ever seen. He attended his last slug club party and was photographed for the album, smiling at the camera, with a ring on his finger that nobody else in the picture would have recognized as anything in particular. He boarded the Hogwarts Express in June of 1945, watched the towers fall away in the window, and travelled south. He had killed 3 people, He had made 2 Horcruxes. He had not turned 18. In the same month that Tom Riddle finished his 7th year at Hogwarts, the most powerful dark wizard of the previous generation was being arrested in Eastern Europe. Gellert Grindelwald had built an empire across the continent through the 1930s and 40s, preaching the superiority of wizards over muggles, gathering followers under a banner of an inscribed triangle, breaking out of one prison and threatening to plunge the wizarding world into open war with the Muggle one. Dumbledore had duelled him in May of 1945 and defeated him. The duel was over in less than an hour. Grindelwald was taken alive. He was locked in a tower called Nurmengard, which he had built himself for the imprisonment of his own enemies. He stayed in that tower for almost 50 years. The wizarding world breathed out. Grindelwald had been defeated. The war was over. The threat was gone. Almost nobody understood that another threat had just stepped onto the Hogwarts Express in the same month, headed south with 2 Horcruxes in his trunk and a third one already half-planned in his head. Part 4. The Lost Years, 1945 to 1956. When Tom Riddle stepped off the Hogwarts Express in the summer of 1945, the wizarding world had every expectation that he was about to become someone important. He had been head boy. He had Slughorn's letter of recommendation in his pocket. He had a perfect record of outstanding marks in every subject he had ever sat. Anne. A boy with that resume could have walked into any senior office at the Ministry of Magic and been groomed for promotion within the year. Several offices made him offers. Slughorn made gentle, anxious recommendations. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement wanted him. The Department of International Magical Cooperation wanted him. Anne. There was even a suggestion from the Visengamot that he might consider, in his early 20s, a junior research post for one of the legal subcommittees. He turned all of it down. He went to work in a shop. The shop was Borgin and Burke's, the same shop that 20 years earlier had bought the Slytherin locket from his mother for 10 galleons. The shop was an institution in Knockturn Alley. It dealt in old, rare, dangerous, and stolen magical objects. Its clientele was wealthy and discreet. Its inventory included cursed jewelry, anatomically active mirrors, hands of glory, and a steady trickle of items whose provenance the shop did not look into too closely. It was, in the polite phrasing of the wizarding world, a curiosity dealer. In honest phrasing, it was a fence. Tom went to work there as an assistant. His job was to walk around to the homes of wealthy elderly witches and wizards and persuade them to sell their family treasures. He was good at it. He was charming. He was beautiful. He was attentive, and he had read every catalogue in the shop so thoroughly that he could speak knowledgeably about any item that came across the counter. The owners of the shop, Caractacus Burke himself among them, considered him a remarkable find. Slughorn was crushed when he heard. He had imagined Tom would rise through the ministry. He could not understand why his star pupil would take a job at a fence in Knockturn. Tom told him politely that he was interested in seeing the artistic side of the magical world, in learning about rare objects, in getting some practical experience before he settled into anything more permanent. Slughorn accepted the explanation. Most of the wizarding world accepted the explanation. It was a strange choice, but it was Tom Riddle, and Tom Riddle was clever enough to make any choice work. The wizarding world filed his name away in the back of its mind and waited to see what he would do next. What he was doing was hunting. He had decided, the night he placed the soul fragment into the ring, that he would make 7 Horcruxes in total. The number was magically significant. It was the number of years a wizard spent at school. It was the number of players on a Quidditch team. It was, in arithmancy, the number associated with perfection and completion. 7 splits of the soul, 6 Horcruxes hidden in the world, and 1 fragment in his own body was the design. He already had 2, he needed 5 more, and he had decided, with the same cold pride that had governed every other choice of his life, that he would not use ordinary objects. He would not hide his soul in a teacup or a button or a stone he had picked up on a road. He would use the heirlooms of the founders of Hogwarts. He had Slytherin's blood. He had a school named for his own ancestor. He would take the surviving relics of all 4 founders, scatter his soul into them, and become, in the most absolute possible sense, the heir of the entire wizarding tradition. The diary and the ring were placeholders. The plan was to be made of founders. The Slytherin locket, he knew, was in private hands. The shop's records told him so. Caractacus Burke had sold it some years after buying it from Merope. The buyer had been a wealthy collector named Hepzibah Smith. Tom went to Mrs. Smith's house at the first invitation, with a kind smile and a small bouquet, and he listened to her talk about her collections for hours. Hepzibah was an elderly witch, comfortably wealthy, eccentric, vain, and lonely. She had inherited her fortune. She liked young men with good manners. She liked, in particular, this particular young man from the shop, who had charming brown eyes and a soft voice, and who seemed to take a real interest in her possessions. She invited him to tea. She invited him to dinner. She invited him back the next week. On one of those visits, she showed him her two greatest treasures. She kept them in a single ornate box of polished black wood, lined inside with red velvet. From the box she lifted first a small golden cup with two delicate handles and a badger engraved on its side. It was the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, founder of Hufflepuff House. It had been in the Smith family for centuries because Hepzibah was, herself, a distant descendant of Hufflepuff. It was a relic of national magical importance. She handled it like a sugar bowl. Then, from the second compartment of the box, she lifted a heavy gold locket on a long chain, with a serpentine S inlaid in green stones across its face. It was the locket of Salazar Slytherin. She had bought it years ago, she explained, from a dreadful little shop in Nocturne. The shopkeeper had not understood what he had. She had paid him many times what he had given for it. The locket was now worth, she boasted, more than her entire house. Tom looked at the two objects. He did not move for several seconds. He was looking at his own ancestor's heirloom, which his own mother had sold to Caractacus Burke for 10 galleons, which an elderly witch with no notion of the bloodline had been wearing around her neck for years. He kept his face perfectly still. He smiled at Hepzibah and told her what magnificent objects they were. He told her that he hoped she would always treasure them. He went back to the shop. He thought, for a few days, about exactly how he was going to take them. He killed Hepzibah Smith 2 days later. He used a slow poison. He left no obvious trace. He framed her ancient house elf Hoki for the murder. He suggested in conversation that Hoki had been seen confused recently, mishandling ingredients, perhaps even mistaking poison for sugar. The ministry investigated. The ministry's investigation was lazy. Anne, the house elf, an old and frightened creature who could not remember exactly what she had done that morning, confessed under questioning. The case was closed. Hoki was sent to a magical creature reservation to live out her last years, broken and uncomprehending. The black wooden box with the cup and the locket disappeared from the house. Hepzibah's grieving cousins were left in a state slightly less impressive than they had been expecting, and they did not look closely at why. Tom Riddle, the polite young man from the shop, attended the funeral, paid his respects, and slipped out before the wake. He resigned from Borgin and Burke's within the month. He told Caractacus Burke that he had decided to travel, to see something of the wider wizarding world before settling into a career. Burke was disappointed. The shop had benefited handsomely from his presence. Burke wished him well. Tom packed a small trunk, took the locket and the cup with him in a charmed leather satchel, and walked out of London. He was 23 years old. Nobody at the ministry, nobody at Hogwarts, nobody in the polite drawing rooms where Slughorn's old students gathered to gossip would see him again for 10 years. We know almost nothing about where he went. We know he passed through Eastern Europe. We know he spent time in Albania, in the mountainous forested regions where wandless folk magic was still practiced openly and where wizarding settlements existed apart from the Western ministries. We know he sought out the keepers of forbidden books, the practitioners of the older necromancies, the men and women who had been turned away by polite wizarding society and now lived in remote villages, in caves, in stone houses on cliff tops, in the corners of the magical world where nobody asked questions. We know he travelled west into the Carpathians and east into Greece and south into North Africa. He read all the time. He learned. Anne. He performed magics that the ministry had not bothered to outlaw, because the ministry had not believed any wizard alive would still be performing them. What he was looking for is more important than where he went. He was looking for two things. The first was deeper knowledge of the Horcrux magic. He wanted to confirm, from sources older than Slughorn's nervous, half-remembered explanations, that the seven-soul design was viable. He wanted to know what the long-term cost of multiple soul fragmentations would actually be. And he wanted to know whether anyone in history had successfully managed more than one Horcrux. The answer, after years of searching, was that the limit had never been formally tested. Almost nobody had been mad enough to try. The few precedents he could find were unclear. Tom decided that this counted as a green light. The second thing he was looking for was followers. He had been a charming boy at school. He had built his Slytherin friendships into a network of useful young men and women, several of whom were already, by their late 20s, occupying minor positions in the British ministry. Those connections were not enough. He wanted a different kind of follower. He wanted wizards who were already comfortable with darkness, who had taken lives, who could be relied on not to flinch at the work he was going to ask of them. He found them in those years abroad, in the back rooms of magical taverns from Bucharest to Athens, in the houses of fugitive duelists, in the quiet correspondence of pure-blood families who had begun to feel, in the years after Grindelwald's fall, that the wizarding world had become too tolerant, too modern, too inclusive of those who, by the old standards, did not belong. Tom listened. He nodded at the right moments. He produced in conversation exactly the political views his hosts wanted to hear, sharpened slightly, made more elegant, more philosophical. He left in each city a small handful of correspondents who would write to him in coded letters for decades. He also began, during these years, to change physically. The Horcrux magic damages its maker. The first split is the worst. Each subsequent split takes a smaller fragment, because there is less soul left to take from, and the diminishment of the remaining whole accelerates. By the time a wizard has split his soul more than once, the change begins to register in the body. The skin loses some of its warmth, the eyes lose some of their humanity, face thins, the features stretch. The wizards who had known Tom Riddle at Hogwarts would have struggled, by the early 1950s, to recognize him on the street. The change was not yet horrifying. He was not yet the snake-like figure that would emerge a quarter of a century later, but the slow erosion of the human face had begun. He performed dark experiments. He tested the limits of necromancy. He cast spells that older texts had warned, in fading ink, were never to be cast. He bound minor creatures to his will. He pushed at the edges of what a single wizard could do with a single wand, and he found that the edges moved when he pushed. He became, during these years abroad, the most powerful dark wizard alive. There were others, scattered across the world, but none with his focus, his discipline, or his terrible patience. He was not in a hurry. He had no urgency. He had built into his own body the assurance that he could not be killed. He had time. He made the locket into his third Horcrux somewhere in the middle of those years. We do not know who he killed for it. There are no missing persons reports from that decade that have been linked to him by any historian. He may have killed a muggle in some forgotten village. He may have killed a fellow wizard whose disappearance was assumed to be voluntary. The locket received the fragment and Tom hid it. The cup he carried with him still. In 1956, after roughly a decade abroad, he came home. The wizard who returned to Britain in that year was unmistakably the same Tom Riddle. He had not gone irretrievably strange yet. He was still recognizable. But he was older than 30 by then and had aged in some way that did not quite track with the calendar, and his eyes had begun to carry the faint red shadow that would, 20 years later, be his most identifying feature. Anne. Old friends from school met him at parties and at restaurants and at small gatherings of pure blood circles, and they said, afterward, that there was something different about him. Not bad, not yet. Different. He had grown up. He had grown into himself. He had become the most charismatic man in any room he walked into, and his old schoolmates fell back under his spell in minutes, as if he had never left. He had returned with a purpose. He went, that year, to the office of the new headmaster of Hogwarts, and he asked for a job. Albus Dumbledore had become headmaster 2 years earlier, after Armando Dipet's retirement. The school was different under him. There was more openness, more reform, more willingness to admit students from backgrounds the old families looked down on. Dumbledore had also become, in those intervening years, the most respected wizard alive. He was the man who had defeated Grindelwald. He was the chief warlock of the Wizengamot. He was the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. He was also, very privately, the man who had been watching Tom Riddle since the boy was 11 years old. Tom asked Dumbledore for the position of Professor of Defense against the Dark Arts. "Anne," he asked politely, with the careful charm that had always worked on the rest of the staff. He pointed out that he had spent the past decade traveling in regions where the dark arts were still practiced openly. He pointed out his record at school. He pointed out his award for special services. He smiled gently and said he believed he could give the school what it needed. Dumbledore listened. Dumbledore asked questions mildly. Dumbledore poured tea, and Dumbledore, in his soft, careful way, said no. He gave a reason that sounded reasonable to anybody outside the room. He said that Tom was still too young to be considered for such a senior post, that the school preferred slightly more seasoned candidates, that perhaps Tom should consider applying again in a few years when he had had time to write up some of his experiences for publication and build a reputation. Tom heard all of that. Underneath all of it, he heard the real answer, which was that Dumbledore had read him exactly. Anne. Dumbledore had understood that Tom was not asking for the post because he wanted to teach. He was asking because the school was the single most magically protected building in Britain, full of children who could be shaped, full of stores of information he wanted access to, and possibly because there was something inside the castle, something connected with the school's founders, that he still wanted to put his hands on. Tom did not show his anger. He thanked the headmaster for his time. Anne. He walked out of the office, down the moving staircase, and across the entrance hall, and out the great front doors of the castle. He stopped at the edge of the lawn, and he looked up at the towers. He had walked into that building at 11, a desperate, strange child, and had walked out at 18, as the most accomplished student in living memory. He had been kept out now by the one man who had ever seen through him. He hated Dumbledore in that moment with a clarity that he had never quite achieved before. He walked down the path toward the gates. He passed Hagrid, who was clearing brushwood from the side of the path. The two men's eyes met for a moment. Hagrid did not look away. Tom did. He walked on. Before he left the school grounds, he did one more thing. He went to a particular spot inside the castle. The exact location has never been publicly recorded, though it is generally understood to have been the room of requirement on the 7th floor. A chamber that appears only when a wizard needs it, and presents itself in whatever form is needed. He took from his satchel a thin diadem, ancient, set with a single sapphire. The diadem was the lost crown of Rowena Ravenclaw, the founder of Ravenclaw House, the wisest of the 4 founders. He had recovered it during his travels. We do not know exactly how. He laid it on a high shelf in that endlessly shifting room between 2 cabinets of forgotten objects, and he turned it into his 4th Horcrux on the spot, using the recent killing of an Albanian peasant whose name has not survived. The diadem accepted the fragment of his soul. He left it where it was. The room of requirement closed around the deposit. The diadem was now hidden inside the very castle that had refused to take him back and would stay there for 41 years, undisturbed by any of the staff or students who lived above it, until the night the entire school burned down around it. He walked out the front gates. He apparated away. He did not enter the building again, in his own body, for the rest of his life. Part 5. The name, 1956 to 1970. For roughly 15 years after his rejection at Hogwarts, Tom Riddle effectively disappeared from public view. He did not return to his shop work. He did not take a ministry post. He did not give interviews. He did not publish. He did not, so far as the ministry's records show, hold an address that anyone could deliver mail to. The name Tom Riddle, in those years, vanished from the wizarding directories. The name Lord Voldemort had not yet taken its place, but it was coming. He had been calling himself Lord Voldemort in private for years by then. He had built it from his own birth name. The letters of Tom Marvolo Riddle, rearranged, spell out the phrase "I am Lord Voldemort." He had worked the anagram out at school, on a piece of parchment in the dormitory, with the curtains drawn around his bed. He had stared at it for a long time, The phrase pleased him. It contained, hidden inside the name the orphanage had given him, the name he had chosen for himself. It was a small private proof that the universe had always intended him to become what he was becoming. The name Voldemort itself was a French construction. Voldemort, flight from death, the whole purpose of his life, given a title. He used the name with his closest associates first, Anne. He had returned from his travels with a small collection of foreign followers and a long list of British schoolmates, whom he had been corresponding with for a decade. He gathered them in private. He brought them into a room, and he told them he was no longer Tom Riddle. He told them he was Lord Voldemort. He told them, in the same evening, exactly what he intended to do with their loyalty. He intended to take the wizarding world, not through politics, which was slow, not through public office, which was constrained, through force, through fear, through a campaign of strategic terror that would, within a single generation, make him the unchallenged ruler of magical Britain and end time of Europe and beyond. The followers in that room agreed. Some agreed because they believed in his vision. Some agreed because they could feel, sitting across the table from him, that disagreement was not survivable. The followers gave themselves a name. They called themselves the Death Eaters. The name was Voldemort's coinage. It was meant to evoke the central promise of the movement, which was that they had transcended ordinary mortality, that they followed a leader who had conquered death, and that those who followed him would themselves be made immune to it. Many of them believed this. A few suspected it was bombast. None of them said so out loud. They wore black robes. They covered their faces with white skull-shaped masks during operations. They carried wands of various lengths and materials, but each of them on the inside of his or her left forearm carried a brand, a serpent issuing from the mouth of a skull. The Dark Mark. The Dark Mark was a small piece of original magic. Voldemort had designed it himself. The brand on the arm was a tether. Through it, he could summon any of his Death Eaters from anywhere in the world. Through it, he could feel their presence. Through it, in time, he would be able to reach for them across great distances. The mark burned when he summoned them. It darkened when his power waxed. It faded almost to nothing when his power waned. None of the Death Eaters quite understood when they accepted the mark how complete a binding they had agreed to. They learned. Some learned in time to do something about it. Most did not. The first generation of Death Eaters were drawn largely from the families Voldemort had cultivated at school. The Lestranges, the Malfoys, the Knots, the Averys, the Rosiers, the Mulcibers, the Crabs, the Goyles. These were the old pure-blood houses of Britain. The families who had spent the previous century watching their political influence ebb away, and as Muggle-born students poured into Hogwarts, and as ministry reform gradually broadened the franchise, they had felt the loss as a personal injury. Voldemort offered them, in plain language, what they had been wanting to hear for 50 years. He told them their blood had value. He told them that the wizarding world was being polluted by the influx of those who did not deserve the privilege of magic. He told them that the way to fix the world was to take it. They believed him. They took the mark. Several of them, by the late 1960s, were already serving as senior figures in the British ministry, where they were leaking documents to him and casting blind eyes to his early operations. He had a particular favourite among them, a woman named Bellatrix Black, of the noble and ancient House of Black, dark-eyed and brilliant, and entirely in love with him in a way that he did not return and did not particularly notice. She would later marry into the Lestrange family. She would become the most feared of his lieutenants. He would entrust her in time with the safekeeping of one of his Horcruxes. She would die for him at the Battle of Hogwarts 30 years later, and her last expression would still be devotion. In the early 1960s, he began the campaign in earnest. He started small. A junior official at the Ministry of Magic disappeared one evening on his way home and was never seen again. A goblin moneylender in Knockturn Alley was found with his throat opened. A pure-blood witch who had spoken publicly against the Death Eaters as politics, found her family home burned to the foundations with everyone in it. The wizarding press of the day did not always connect these incidents. The ministry filed them under separate investigations. It would not be until the early 1970s that the Daily Prophet would begin to admit in cautious editorials that a pattern existed, and by then the pattern had been running for 15 years. He hid the cup of Helga Hufflepuff in the vault of Bellatrix Lestrange at Gringotts. She had married Rodolphus Lestrange by then. Their vault was deep in the bank, behind layers of ancient goblin protection. He gave her the cup and told her, in a few quiet words, that it was the most precious object in his possession, that it was to be kept in the bottom of her vault, that she was never to remove it for any reason, and that her life was forfeit if any harm came to it. She kissed his hand. She placed the cup at the back of her vault, in a small stone alcove, behind chests of gold she did not particularly care about, and there it sat for 35 years. He hid the locket of Salazar Slytherin in a sea cave on the coast of Britain, in a location only he could reach. The cave was approached across deep water by boat. The interior contained an underground lake. In the center of the lake was a small stone island. On the island stood a stone basin filled with a clear potion. At the bottom of the basin, beneath the potion, in a small stone alcove, sat the locket. The potion would not respond to wand magic or to a spoon. It would only respond to being drunk. Anyone who drank it would suffer hallucinations of overwhelming dread, would grow extremely thirsty, would call out for water, and would, on completing the basin, be too weak to leave the island. The lake itself was full of inferi. Inferi are the magically reanimated corpses of dead men and women, bound to obey a single command, which in this case was to drag anyone who entered the water under and drown them. Voldemort had created the entire arrangement personally. He had stood on the small stone island and considered it and pronounced it sufficient. He had taken the locket and placed it in the basin. He had covered it with the potion. He had apparated out of the cave and never returned, because there was no reason to. He hid the diary of his own school years at a different layer of the security architecture. He gave it for safekeeping to one of his most trusted Death Eaters, a man named Lucius Malfoy, with strict instructions that the diary was to be hidden in the Malfoy family vault and never produced unless he, Voldemort, asked for it personally. Lucius did not know what the diary was. He understood only that it was important. He took it home and put it in a locked drawer in the second most private room in Malfoy Manor, and there it sat for many years, until Lucius, decades later, would make the worst decision of his life and try to use it. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw was already in the room of requirement at Hogwarts. The ring of the Gaunts was in a place we have not yet discussed, which was the dirt floor of the same ramshackle shack where his uncle Morphin had lived. Voldemort had returned to the shack in the late 1940s, sometime after Morphin's death in Azkaban, and had hidden the ring there beneath the floorboards, under a series of curses that would kill any intruder who tried to take it. He had wanted it close to the family land. He had wanted it where his mother had grown up. There was an emotional logic to the hiding place that was, perhaps, the only sentimental gesture in his entire adult life. He never admitted it as such. By the end of the 1960s, he had 4 Horcruxes hidden. The 5th, the cup, was in Bellatrix's vault. The 6th and 7th he had not yet made. He had decided on the objects. He was waiting for the right deaths to make them with. He had time. Killings had been growing in frequency and in scale through the back half of the decade. Anne. By 1970, the wizarding world was no longer in any doubt that something was happening. The Daily Prophet ran its first cover story on the missing persons epidemic in the spring of that year. Aurors had been losing their lives in suspicious circumstances. Pure-blood politicians who had spoken against the Death Eater agenda had been disappearing one by one. Anne, a young Auror named Alastor Moody, who had distinguished himself by going head-to-head with several Death Eater operations, was reaching the senior ranks of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and was beginning to assemble what would, by the end of the decade, become a list of suspected Death Eater identities. The Ministry was not yet at war. The Ministry was beginning to understand that it might soon be. The name that the public was in those early years was not yet Lord Voldemort. The Death Eaters used the name among themselves. They spoke it openly in their private gatherings, but Voldemort himself had begun by the mid-1960s to enforce a peculiar etiquette around his name. He let it be known, by careful leaks, that the name was not to be spoken aloud by anyone who feared him. He told his followers to refer to him as the Dark Lord. he told outsiders, through the few terrified witnesses who survived their encounters with him. To refer to him only as you know who, or he who must not be named. There was a magical underpinning to this prohibition that became formal later, but in those early years it was simply rhetoric, a power play. He understood that fear is most effective when it cannot quite be addressed by its own word. He understood that if you forbid the name, you make the named thing larger. He understood, in short, the basic psychology of a tyrant. He used it. By the autumn of 1970, the wizarding world of Britain knew that it had a problem. It did not know how big the problem was going to become. Albus Dumbledore knew. He had been watching, from his headmaster's office. For 15 years, he had been making lists of his own. He had been keeping notes on the disappearances and on the pattern of the families being targeted. He had been having quiet conversations with members of the Wizengamot, and with the senior Aurors, and with the trusted few among the school staff, Anne. He had not been able, in any of those conversations, to produce the one piece of information that would have made the picture clear. He could not yet say openly that the person behind the campaign was the missing former Hogwarts student, Tom Riddle. He had no proof Dumbledore could give the Ministry that would have convinced anybody. The Ministry would not have wanted to be convinced. The idea that one of the most accomplished students ever to leave the school had become the most dangerous wizard of the age was an idea most respectable wizards found impossible to accept. So Dumbledore waited, he prepared. Anne. He began, in those final months of 1970, to draw together a small private group of trusted wizards who he believed would be willing to fight. He called the group the Order of the Phoenix. The first meeting was held in a back room at the Hogshead in Hogsmeade in the spring of 1971. 23 people attended. By the time the First War ended a decade later, most of them would be dead. Part 6. The First Wizarding War, 1970 to 1981. The Wizarding War that began in the early 1970s was the most destructive period in the modern history of magical Britain. It was a slow war, fought in raids and assassinations rather than in great battles, and it lasted for the better part of 11 years. By the end of it, the wizarding population of Britain had been reduced by an estimated 25%. Whole families had been extinguished. Entire branches of the old genealogies, families that had been intermarrying since the 15th century, had been wiped out in a single night and never recovered. The Ministry of Magic had been infiltrated to such a depth that no senior position in the building was considered safe from compromise. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was at war, in effect, with itself. Aurors did not trust the wizards working in the next office. School children learned, in their first weeks at Hogwarts, that you did not write your home address in a letter, because letters could be intercepted, and you did not say your parents' names aloud in the corridors, because the walls were never quite safe. The war began in the open in the autumn of 1970. Anne. By then the Death Eaters were a formal organisation with internal ranks, regional cells, and a working command structure. Voldemort himself was rarely seen. He commanded through emissaries. The senior Death Eaters who carried his orders included Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus Lestrange, his brother Rabastan Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, Antonin Dolohov, the Carrow twins Amicus and Alecto, Augustus Rookwood, who was a senior official inside the Department of Mysteries and was leaking everything that crossed his desk, and the elder Crouch family disaster, Barty Crouch Jr., who was the son of the senior Auror Barty Crouch Sr. The younger Crouch had taken the dark mark in his late teens. His father did not know. He would not learn until it was too late. The Death Eaters were not the only forces under Voldemort's command. He had recruited beyond the wizarding pureblood circles, the Dementors, the soul-sucking creatures who had been guarding Azkaban prison for centuries on a contractual arrangement with the Ministry, began, in the early 1970s, to drift away from their posts at night. They had heard, in whatever way Dementors communicate, that there was a wizard, offering them more reliable feedings than the Ministry was providing. They went to him quietly. Several of them began to operate openly with the Death Eaters by the middle of the decade, leaving Azkaban's lower levels staffed at well below the official number. The Ministry covered this up for years. The decision to cover it up was made by a series of ministers who did not want to admit that the prison's central defense had been compromised. And the cover-up made the situation worse, because auras patrolling the moors and the highlands kept running into dementors and never being briefed in advance that they should expect them. The werewolves came in too. They came largely under the command of a wizard named Fenrir Greyback, who was not, strictly speaking, a wizard. He was a werewolf. He had been one for most of his adult life. He had, unusually for a werewolf of that era, embraced the transformation as an identity rather than a curse. He hunted children in particular, Anne. He liked to position himself near the homes of his targets on the night of the full moon, transform and bite the children in their beds so that they would grow up as werewolves themselves. He had been doing this for years before Voldemort approached him. Voldemort offered him better hunting grounds and political protection. Greyback accepted. He brought with him a network of werewolf packs across Britain who had been living, until then, on the margins of magical society, despised by the polite world, denied wand licenses, denied jobs, denied the right to marry or to attend Hogwarts. They had a great many grievances, and Voldemort knew how to feed them. They came over to him in substantial numbers. The giants came in too after a fashion. The giant population in Britain had been declining for centuries. There were perhaps 80 remaining in the high mountain settlements of Scotland and the Western Islands, organised into a handful of small clans, and they had been at internal war with each other for several generations. Voldemort sent emissaries into the giant lands in the mid-1970s. He promised the surviving clans territory, recognition, and revenge against the wizarding governments that had pushed them out of the lowlands. Most of the clans listened. Most of them, eventually, joined the Death Eaters, at least in principle, although the giants were never reliable allies and tended to wander off the assignments they had been given. Inside the Death Eater command, one figure rose with unusual speed in the mid-1970s, a young man named Severus Snape. He had grown up in a poor mill town in the north of England, the son of a Muggle father and a witch mother who had married badly. He had been a brilliant Hogwarts student in Slytherin, with a particular gift for potions and a private interest in the dark arts that he had pursued in the library since he was 11. He had been a friend of Lily Evans, a Muggle-born witch in his year, until the friendship broke under the weight of his association with the pureblood crowd. He had left school in 1978 and gone almost directly into the Death Eaters. He was 19 years old when he took the Dark Mark. He was in those early years one of the most useful Death Eaters Voldemort had. He was clever, he was loyal, he was quiet. He could brew any potion Voldemort named, and several Voldemort had only heard about. He was in his own way completely sincere in his belief that he had joined the right side of history. The Order of the Phoenix, in the same period, was growing too. Dumbledore had recruited carefully. The full membership list of the Order in those years included Alastor Moody, the senior Auror, Edgar Bones, a ministry official from the prominent Bones family, Marlene McKinnon, a young witch from another prominent family, Gideon and Fabian Pruitt, the brothers of a woman named Molly Weasley, who was at home in Devon raising what would eventually be 7 children of her own, Frank and Alice Longbottom, both Aurors, both purebloods, both deeply committed, Caradoc Dearborn, who would disappear in 1979 and whose body would never be found, Benji Fenwick, who would be killed in 1980 and whose body would be found in pieces, Dorcas Meadows, killed personally by Voldemort in 1981, Emmeline Vance, Hestia Jones, Sturgis Podmore, Mundungus Fletcher, Aberforth Dumbledore, the headmaster's estranged brother, Hagrid, who had stayed on at Hogwarts as keeper of keys and grounds, and who was used by the Order as a courier. The 4 young men who would later be known as the Marauders, James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, and Lily Evans, who had married James Potter in the autumn of 1978. Most of them did not survive the war. The Bones family was attacked in 1979. Edgar and his wife and his small children were killed in their home in a single evening. Only one member of the family escaped, a young woman named Amelia, who had been visiting friends that weekend and who would, decades later, become head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and would die at Voldemort's hand in the Second War. The McKinnon family was attacked in 1981. Marlene McKinnon, her parents and her brothers, all killed in a single Death Eater raid on their home. The house was burned to the foundations. The bodies were identified by wand fragments. The Wizarding Press did not learn the names of the dead for several days because the family had been hiding under an alias. Gideon and Fabian Pruitt, the two Order brothers, died together in a single fight against 5 Death Eaters in a back lane in Lancashire in 1980. They fought for the better part of an hour. The 5 Death Eaters who killed them included Antonin Dolohov, who would later boast about it. Anne. The Pruitts took some of their attackers with them. Molly Weasley, their sister, was at home in Devon. With the 4 children she had at that point, the youngest 2 of them twin boys, she would name Fred and George, after no particular relative. She heard about her brothers' deaths from an Order owl that arrived at her kitchen window in the small hours. She never quite stopped mourning them. The war was not all defeats. There were Order victories. There were Death Eaters captured. Augustus Rookwood was eventually exposed as a spy inside the Department of Mysteries. Although he would escape Azkaban in the Second War, Barty Crouch Jr. would be captured in 1980 and sentenced to Azkaban by his own father. Lucius Malfoy, who was clever, avoided capture and would later use his money and his political connections to keep himself out of prison after the war ended. Several Death Eaters were killed in fights with Aurors. The Wizarding Press in those years ran obituaries on alternating pages with crime reports, and the readers of the Daily Prophet learned to recognize the names of both the dead and the suspected before they had finished their morning tea. In the spring of 1980, in a small upstairs room of a public house in Hogsmeade called the Hog's Head, a small piece of magic occurred that would change the entire course of the war. The owner of the pub was Aberforth Dumbledore. He had agreed, as a favour to his older brother, to host a job interview that evening. The candidate was a young witch named Sybil Trelawney, the great-great-granddaughter of a famous seer named Cassandra Trelawney, who had been hoping for years to be considered for the divination post at Hogwarts. Albus Dumbledore had agreed to interview her as a courtesy. He had no real expectation of hiring her. Divination was a soft discipline. He himself doubted the entire field. He met her in the upstairs room. They talked for some time. Anne. He was preparing to thank her politely and conclude the meeting when her eyes rolled back in her head. Her voice deepened by an octave, and she delivered a prophecy. Prophecies in our world are rare. True prophecies, the kind that take physical form and store themselves in the prophecy chambers in the Department of Mysteries, occur perhaps once or twice a decade across all of British magic. The one Trelawney spoke that evening was real, Anne. It said that a child would be born at the end of the 7th month to parents who had thrice defied the Dark Lord, and that this child would have power the Dark Lord knew not, and that one of them must die at the hand of the other, for neither could live while the other survived. Dumbledore listened. Trelawney woke a moment later, with no memory of having said anything at all. He thanked her, hired her on the spot, and went downstairs to settle the bill. As he came down the stairs, he discovered that one of the patrons of the pub had been pressed against the door of the upstairs room for the past several minutes, listening through the keyhole. The patron was a young man with greasy black hair and a guilty expression. He had heard, before Aberforth threw him out, the first half of the prophecy. He had heard it clearly enough to repeat it. Dumbledore did not know exactly how much he had heard. He had to assume the worst. The eavesdropper was Severus Snape. Snape went directly from the pub to his master and repeated what he had heard. He did not understand what he was carrying. He thought he was bringing his master a useful piece of strategic intelligence. He did not realize until much later that he had just signed the death warrant of the only woman he had ever loved. Settle in for a moment. We are roughly halfway through the night. Anne, if you are still awake, you are doing better than you might think. If you have drifted in and out for the last hour, that is exactly what this is for. Anne. A quiet thank you to those of you who have left comments on previous videos telling us how many nights you have been falling asleep with these stories. Those comments are read. They shape what gets made next. If you have been enjoying this one, a quiet, like before you drift off, helps the channel more than you would guess. Anne. If you have a favorite corner of the wizarding world you would like covered in a future video, leave it in the comments. We will see what we can do. Now, back to Godric's Hollow. Part 6 continued. Godric's Hollow. Voldemort considered the prophecy for some weeks. He had to identify the child it referred to. The conditions were specific. A child born at the end of the 7th month, to parents who had thrice defied him. There were 2 candidates, 2 families in the Order of the Phoenix who fit the description. The Potters, James and Lily, who had defied him 3 times in the field over the previous 2 years, and whose son Harry had been born on the 31st of July 1980, and the Longbottoms, Frank and Alice, who had also defied him 3 times, and whose son Neville had been born on the 30th of July 1980, 1 day before Harry. Anne. He looked at both families, he weighed them, he thought about which child the prophecy might be describing, and he made, in the most consequential decision of his entire long campaign, a choice based on identification rather than on strategy. He chose Harry Potter. He chose him because Harry was a half-blood, like himself. He saw in the Potter child a version of his own younger self, born into a similar mixed-blood ambiguity, and he decided that this child was the one the prophecy had marked, and that he, Voldemort, would mark him in return. The decision was, in retrospect, the only major strategic mistake Voldemort ever made in his career. The Longbottom child, had he gone after that one, might have been the actual subject of the prophecy. He never knew. The choice he made closed the question. The Potters knew by then that they were a target. Dumbledore had told them the substance of the prophecy. He had warned them that Voldemort was actively seeking the child it referred to. He had urged them to go into hiding, and they had agreed. Their hiding place was a small cottage in the village of Godric's Hollow in the West Country, an old wizarding settlement where Bathilda Bagshot, the historian, lived, where the graves of several famous wizards dated back to the medieval period, and where the Potters could blend into a small community of friendly old families. The cottage was placed under the Fidelius charm in the early autumn of 1981. The Fidelius charm is one of the most powerful protective spells in our world. It hides a piece of information inside the soul of a single chosen wizard, the Secret Keeper. Only the Secret Keeper can reveal the information. Anyone else, no matter how knowledgeable, will be unable to see or remember the protected location, even if they are standing directly outside it. The Secret Keeper was originally going to be Sirius Black, James Potter's closest friend and Harry's godfather. Sirius and James had been inseparable since they had met on the Hogwarts Express at 11. Sirius was by any measure the obvious choice. He was also, for that reason, the obvious target. Death Eaters watching the Potters knew that Sirius would be the Secret Keeper. Sirius himself worried that he was too obvious a target, that he might be tortured into giving up the information before he could resist. So he suggested, 2 days before the charm was performed, that they switch, use someone else as the Secret Keeper, someone the Death Eaters would never suspect. The little man, Peter Pettigrew, the 4th of the Marauders, the friend who was always tagging along behind James and Sirius, who had been mocked at school for being slow and round and timid. James and Lily agreed. They told Dumbledore they had picked Pettigrew. Dumbledore offered to be the Secret Keeper himself, which would have been the strongest protection available to anyone. They declined. They trusted Peter. They should not have. Peter Pettigrew had been spying for Voldemort for over a year by then. He had taken the Dark Mark in the summer of 1980. He had been feeding the Death Eaters information on Order operations for months. He had betrayed the locations of 2 safe houses already. He had betrayed Caradoc Dearborn, who had vanished without trace. He had betrayed Marlene McKinnon, whose family had been wiped out 3 months before. He had done all of this because he was a small, frightened man who had decided that the winning side was Voldemort's side, and that being on the losing side at the moment of victory would be a fatal mistake. He had a particular gift for being underestimated. James and Sirius had been underestimating him for 10 years. Severus Snape, in those weeks, was breaking. He had carried the prophecy to Voldemort in good faith. He had understood, when Voldemort settled on the Potter child as the target, that the prophecy mentioned a son, and a mother and a father. Lily was the mother, Lily Evans, the witch he had loved since he was a small boy on the swings of a public park in Cokeworth, was about to be murdered because of information he had given his master. He could not bear it. He went to Voldemort directly and asked, in the strongest terms he could manage, that Lily be spared. He framed the request as if it were a personal favour. Voldemort agreed, dismissively. He told Snape that the woman would be invited to step aside. If she did, she would live. If she did not, she would not. Snape understood, looking at him, that Voldemort would kill her without a second thought if she even hesitated. He went directly from Voldemort's headquarters to Dumbledore. He met Dumbledore on a windswept hilltop in the autumn dusk. He begged Dumbledore to hide the Potters somewhere Voldemort could never find them. He offered, in exchange, anything Dumbledore asked. Dumbledore asked him to become a double agent, to work inside the Death Eaters and report to the Order. Snape, in that moment, with the rain coming sideways and his soul splitting in two, agreed. The Fidelius charm was performed. The Potters became invisible. Voldemort, who had been planning to attack them for weeks, could not find them. Anne. He spent the month of October hunting their hiding place, with the Death Eaters interrogating anyone who might have known where they were, and finding nothing. On the evening of the 31st of October 1981, Peter Pettigrew met with his master and told him the address. Voldemort went alone. He did not bring any Death Eaters. He had not bothered. The job, in his estimation, did not require help. Anne. He apparated to the front gate of the cottage at Godric's Hollow at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening. Inside, James and Lily were finishing the bath of their 15th-old son. They had not had a proper meal in days. They had been living on whatever the Order could smuggle in. Anne. They were both holding the baby together in the living room, with the curtains drawn and the fire low, when James heard the gate creak. He stood up. He went to the window. He saw, in the front garden, a tall, thin figure in a black cloak. He understood, immediately, that the secret had been broken. He told Lily to take Harry and run. He had no time to draw his wand, because his wand was on the coffee table, and Voldemort was already coming through the front door. James went to meet him in the hallway with his bare hands. Voldemort killed him with a single curse. The body of James Potter fell across the foot of the stairs. Lily had Harry. She had run upstairs to the nursery. She had no time to apparate. She was a witch, but she was a young witch, not particularly skilled at high-pressure spell work, and she had a baby in her arms. She put Harry into his crib. She turned to face the door. She did not have her wand either. She had left it in the living room. She heard the footsteps on the stairs. She heard Voldemort enter the nursery. She heard him say, in his voice that had become like the sound of dry leaves moving in a cold wind, that she should stand aside. He told her to stand aside, and the boy would not be harmed. He told her several times. She did not stand aside. She stood in front of the crib, and she begged him instead to take her and to leave the child. She said the words, "Please not Harry, please. Take me instead." She said them more than once. Voldemort listened. He had promised, in his offhand way, to spare her. He had told Snape he would. He was a man of his word in the strictest sense, when no inconvenience attached to the keeping of it. But it was inconvenient to spare her. She would not stand aside. She kept moving in front of the crib. He had a child to kill and a mother in the way. He raised his wand and he killed her. The body of Lily Potter fell across the floor of the nursery. The baby in the crib, who was old enough by then to recognize his mother's voice, made the high distressed sound that babies make. Voldemort turned to the crib. He pointed his wand at the small face. He spoke the killing curse for the 3rd time in 3 minutes. He spoke it cleanly. He had spoken it perhaps 200 times in his career. He knew exactly how it worked. The curse did not work. The green light came out of his wand. It travelled the short distance from the wand to the child. It struck the child on the forehead, in the place where, for the rest of the child's life, a thin lightning-shaped scar would mark the impact point. And then it stopped. The curse, in some way that no surviving wizarding theorist has ever entirely explained, rebounded. It came back along the line it had travelled. It struck the man who had cast it, and Lord Voldemort's body, which had become, over the previous 35 years, the most carefully preserved instrument of magical power in the world, was destroyed. His body was destroyed, not he himself. The Horcruxes held him to the world. The fragment of soul still inside his body was torn from it, and his body fell, and the soul fragment escaped through the broken roof of the cottage and into the night. It went looking for something to inhabit. It found at first nothing. It went away east. What also happened in those few seconds was something Voldemort had not designed and could not have predicted. The killing curse, in striking a wizarding subject and rebounding, had broken his soul one more time. It had broken it in a way that had not been planned. The piece of his soul that came loose in the act of destruction did not return to him. It did not escape with the rest of him. It went instead into the nearest living thing in the room, into the baby in the crib. Lord Voldemort, in the moment of his apparent defeat, had made one final Horcrux, unintentionally by accident, in a creature he had been trying to kill. The seventh fragment of his soul became lodged behind a lightning-shaped scar on the forehead of a small boy named Harry James Potter, and there it would remain for the next 16 years. Peter Pettigrew, who had been watching the cottage from a distance, fled when he saw the upstairs windows blow out. He understood that something had gone wrong. He apparated away. He went into hiding. Sirius Black, who had been visiting Pettigrew's safe house earlier that evening and had found it strangely empty, raced to Godric's Hollow as soon as he sensed something was amiss. He arrived at the cottage some hours after the attack. He found James in the hallway and Lily on the nursery floor and his godson alive in the crib, with a small bleeding cut on his forehead and a soft, constant cry. Sirius held the baby for several minutes. Then Hagrid arrived. Dumbledore had sent him. Hagrid had been instructed to bring Harry to Privet Drive in Surrey, to the home of Lily's muggle sister Petunia and her husband Vernon, where Dumbledore had decided the child would be safest under the residual blood magic of his mother's sacrifice. Sirius did not want to give up the baby, he argued. Hagrid pressed. Eventually Sirius gave in. He gave the baby to Hagrid. He also gave Hagrid the flying motorbike he owned, on the grounds that he would no longer be needing it. He went off into the night looking for Pettigrew. He found Pettigrew the next morning on a crowded Muggle street in London. Pettigrew, who could not duel Sirius and knew it, played the only card he had. He shouted loudly, for all of the Muggle witnesses to hear, that Sirius had betrayed Lily and James. Then he cut off one of his own fingers, used a curse to blow open the street behind himself, killed 12 Muggle bystanders in the explosion, and transformed into a rat. He was an unregistered animagus, which Sirius and James had known about for years, but had not told anybody. He scurried away down a drain. By time the Aurors arrived, Sirius Black was standing in the middle of a crater laughing, because he had finally understood that he had been outmaneuvered and there was nothing left to do but laugh. The Aurors arrested him for the murder of 12 Muggles and of Peter Pettigrew. He was sent to Azkaban without trial. He stayed there for 12 years. The wizarding world, that morning, woke up to the news that Lord Voldemort was dead. There was open celebration in the streets. People wept in public who had not wept since their children had died. The Daily Prophet ran a special edition. Owl Post moved faster than the trains. Hogwarts students, walking to class, learned the news from the staff, who could not stop smiling. Across the country, scattered Death Eaters heard what had happened and went to ground, hiding their dark marks, faking ignorance, claiming they had been under the Imperious curse all along. Lucius Malfoy was particularly successful with this defense. He was acquitted within months. Several other senior Death Eaters were less lucky and ended up in Azkaban. Anne. The Lestranges, including Bellatrix, were not arrested in 1981 because nobody had been able to gather enough evidence against them. They would be arrested 2 months later for a separate crime, of which more in a moment. Severus Snape was protected by Dumbledore's personal testimony and walked free. He took a job at Hogwarts that autumn as potions master. The story of Voldemort, as far as the wizarding world was concerned, was over. He was dead. Anne. The boy who had survived him, who had become almost overnight the most famous child in the wizarding world, was hidden away with his Muggle aunt and uncle in a quiet street in Surrey, and most people accepted that the strange and terrible time was finished. It was not finished. He was not dead. He was a soul fragment without a body, drifting east through a cold November night, looking for somewhere to settle. Part 7. The Wraith Years, 1981 to 1991. The soul fragment that left Godric's Hollow on the night of the 31st of October was not a man. It was not even, by any ordinary definition, a ghost. Ghosts are the imprints of full souls who have chosen to remain in this world rather than passing on. The thing that escaped the cottage was a piece of a soul, less than a tenth of the original whole, the only fragment of Voldemort that still inhabited his physical body at the moment the curse rebounded. The Horcruxes were inert. They held him here. They could not act for him. They could not make decisions. They could not move. Anne, the fragment that had been in his body, was the only piece of him capable of independent thought, and it had been thrown out of its container, and it had nowhere to go. Anne. It drifted. Anne. It went east across the English Channel, because the wind was going east that night, and the fragment had nothing in it strong enough to pick its own direction. It crossed France and Germany. It crossed the Carpathians. It came, perhaps 3 weeks after the night of Halloween, to the dark forested mountains of Albania, where Voldemort had spent the most productive years of his foreign exile. There was a familiarity there. The forests of Albania had been one of the places where, in his 30s, he had felt the most clear-headed. He had cast some of his most powerful early dark magic in those woods. He had buried teachers there. He had killed there. There were echoes of his own self in those mountains, magical residues he had left in the rocks and the trees, and the soul fragment recognized them. It settled in. It could not exist on its own indefinitely. A soul fragment of that size needed a body. It could not regrow itself a body from nothing. The best it could do was inhabit a body that already existed, share a mind that was already operating, hide inside another consciousness, and feed off it. In the Albanian forests, Voldemort began, for the first time in his magical career, to inhabit small animals. He took serpents most often. They were the easiest to enter and the easiest to control. Anne. He would settle himself inside a snake, and the snake would move through the forest, and Voldemort would experience the world through its senses for as long as it lived. When the snake died, which most snakes did within weeks, he would leave the body and find another one. He spent some years like this, years inside one snake after another, in a forest in Eastern Europe, watching the seasons turn over, unable to cast a single spell, unable to harm anyone or anything beyond what a snake could reach. It was the lowest period of his existence. He had, in the strictest sense, become a parasite. The wizarding world he had left behind was, in the same years, going through its own slow rearrangement. The ministry was busy, and Death Eater trials were running through 1981 and 1982, and into 1983. Most of the captured Death Eaters were tried by a panel of judges chaired by Barty Crouch, Sr., who was at that time head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and the frontrunner for the next Minister for Magic. Crouch ran the trials hard. He authorized the use of the unforgivable curses by auras. He cut corners on evidence. He sent Sirius Black, as we have already noted, to Azkaban without trial. He sent several other lesser-known Death Eaters there on evidence that would not have stood up in any honest court. He believed that hard tactics were necessary in a wartime situation. He believed in his own way that he was doing the right thing. He was a man with a great deal of moral conviction and very little moral imagination. The most painful trial of his career came in early 1982. Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus Lestrange, his brother Rabastan Lestrange, and a fourth wizard had been arrested for the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom. The Longbottoms had been senior auras. They had been targeted shortly after the fall of Voldemort by these 4 Death Eaters, who had refused to accept that their master was gone and who had attacked the Longbottoms in their home. Believing that the Longbottoms knew where Voldemort was, they had used the Cruciatus curse on Frank and Alice for hours in front of their 1-year-old son Neville, Anne. They had not stopped until both of the Longbottoms had passed beyond ordinary human consciousness into a kind of permanent fractured silence from which they would never recover. The Longbottoms had not died. They had lived another 40 years in a long-term ward at St. Mungo's Hospital, the Janus Thicky ward, where their son visited them every week and where his grandmother brought him every holiday, and where neither Frank nor Alice ever quite recognized him. The fourth wizard arrested for the attack on the Longbottoms was the son of Barty Crouch Sr. himself. Barty Crouch Jr., the young man who had taken the dark mark in his teens and who had served Voldemort with a particular and disturbing zeal. He was arrested in the same operation as the Lestranges. The trial was a public spectacle. Crouch Sr. presided. His own son sat in the chained chair in the middle of the courtroom and screamed at his father not to send him to Azkaban. His father sent him there. The boy was given a life sentence. He was carried out of the chamber by Dementors, sobbing, swearing he was innocent. Anne, Crouch Sr.'s wife, who was already terminally ill, asked her husband in the months that followed if he would do one last thing for her. She wanted to visit their son in prison, and she wanted to switch places with him, take Polyjuice potion, become him, let him out with her own face. Crouch Sr., who could not refuse her any final wish, agreed. The switch was made some weeks before her death. The woman who died in Azkaban looked to the Dementors like the young Death Eater on the cell list. The young man who came out looked, in public, like the dying mother. He was hidden afterward for years under the Imperious curse in his father's house, under an invisibility cloak, watched over by the family house elf. He stayed there for 13 years. The wizarding world believed he was dead. His father carried the secret. The boy did not stop hating his father. He waited. We will see him again. A handful of other Death Eaters wormed their way out of prosecution. Igor Karkaroff, who had been captured early, named several lower-ranking Death Eaters in exchange for his own freedom. And he was released. He went abroad shortly afterward and took up the headmastership of the Durmstrang Institute in Northern Europe, where he could not easily be reached. Lucius Malfoy bought his way out of any serious legal exposure by donating heavily to the Ministry of Magic and to St. Mungo's and to several Wizengamot members' favoured charities, and by claiming with elaborate sincerity that he had been a victim of the Imperious curse for years. Antonin Dolohov and the rest of the inner circle who had been caught ended up in the high-security wing of Azkaban with the Lestranges and the Crouch placeholder. There were 10 of them by the end of the trials. They sat in their cells. They lost their minds slowly. They waited for nothing in particular, because most of them did not expect that anything was ever coming for them. Bellatrix Lestrange was the exception. She continued to believe, year after year, that her master would return. She told the other prisoners as much. They mostly ignored her. The Dementors moved up and down the corridor at all hours of the day and night, sucking what was left of the prisoners' happiness out through the bars. At Hogwarts, life resumed. Albus Dumbledore went back to running the school. The Order of the Phoenix was disbanded, more or less. There was no enemy left to fight, so far as anybody could publicly demonstrate, and most of its surviving members wanted to grieve and to rebuild and to raise children. Dumbledore quietly kept the membership list current. He did not believe Voldemort was permanently gone. He had been thinking about the Horcrux problem since the early 1960s. He had collected, by the late 1970s, more evidence than anyone else alive that Voldemort had performed the soul-splitting magic. He could not prove it. He had nobody he could safely tell. He sat with the evidence in his office, year after year, watching the school empty in summer and fill in autumn, watching the children grow up, watching their hair go from blonde to brown and back again under the sorting hat. And he waited. Severus Snape took up his post as potions master in the autumn of 1981. He was 21 years old. He was, by some distance, the youngest member of the staff. He did not get on with the other teachers, and he did not get on with the students, and he did not get on with anyone, really, except Dumbledore, with whom he had a relationship of professional intimacy that nobody else in the building quite understood. He taught potions for years. He hated most of his pupils, especially the ones who reminded him of James Potter, which by his own reckoning was several students per year. He kept his dark mark covered. He told no one what it meant. He understood, with the bleak clarity of a man who has seen exactly what he is doing, that he was now a double agent in a war that almost everyone else believed was over. Peter Pettigrew, who had gone into hiding the night Voldemort fell, did not stay near London. He had to disappear, absolutely. He could not afford to be recognized by anyone who had known him before the fall. He was an animagus. He took the form of a rat. He found, in the chaos of early 1982, the family of a poor wizarding household in Devon, the Weasleys, and he attached himself to the youngest child of the household, a small red-haired boy named Percy, who fell in love with his new pet and named him Scabbers. Percy looked after the rat for 2 years before giving him as a hand-me-down to his younger brother Ron. Ron looked after him for the next decade. Scabbers slept on Ron's pillow. Scabbers travelled with Ron on the Hogwarts Express. Scabbers attended classes at Hogwarts on the inside of Ron's pocket. Pettigrew lived as a rat for 13 years, eating off Ron's plate, sleeping in Ron's bed, listening to every conversation in the Weasley household. He was waiting. He did not believe his master was permanently gone any more than Bellatrix believed it. He was simply, after his own fashion, more patient about waiting. He had the gift of being able to disappear into the smallness of his own role. Nobody noticed him because there was nothing to notice. He was a pet. He was almost a piece of furniture. The years passed. In 1981, the year-old students at Hogwarts had been born in 1970 or so. By 1990, the year-old students were the babies of 1979. 1991, the year-old students were the children of 1980, the generation born into the dying days of the First War. Anne, the most famous of them, Harry James Potter, was still living with his mother's sister at Privet Drive, growing up entirely outside the wizarding world, with no memory of his parents, no knowledge of his own scar's meaning, and a deep daily acquaintance with the cupboard under the stairs. The man whose name nobody used had not been heard from in 10 years. In the spring of 1991, a young Hogwarts professor named Quirinus Quirrell took a sabbatical. Quirrell had been teaching Muggle studies. He was a stammering, nervous, slightly comic figure who had become a fixture of the staff room without ever really impressing anybody. He had decided, the previous winter, that he needed to expand his knowledge in order to qualify for a more serious teaching post. He had decided specifically that he was going to apply for the Defense Against the Dark Arts position when it next opened, and that he needed practical experience in dealing with dark creatures and dark magic in order to be considered. He told the staff at Hogwarts he was going to travel through Eastern Europe for a year. He left over the summer break of 1990. He went, of all places, into the Albanian forests. He went looking for trouble. He had heard rumours, travellers' stories, reports in the foreign magical press of strange occurrences in the deep woods, of small dark presences haunting the villages, of the kind of thing he had told himself he wanted to study. He went looking for a residue of dark power he could observe and write up. What he found, perhaps 3 weeks into his expedition, was a snake in a clearing that did not move when he approached it, and then, slowly, lifted its head and looked at him and spoke. What happened in the clearing took several days. Anne. Quirrell did not understand at first what he was talking to. Anne. He thought he had stumbled into a haunting, or perhaps a possessed animal, or perhaps simply a very advanced piece of dark conjuration. The voice that came out of the snake was charming and patient, and seemed to know exactly what Quirrell was insecure about. It told him things about himself. It told him about his nervousness, about his ambitions, about the way the other staff members at Hogwarts looked down on him, without ever quite saying so. It told him gently that there was an old wizard inside the snake, an old great wizard who had been brought low by misfortune and was looking for a host, a companion, a partner, who would offer him a home in exchange for power and knowledge that could not be obtained anywhere else. Quirrell, who was lonely and proud and easily impressed, hesitated for about 3 days and then agreed. The arrangement they reached was unusual. Voldemort would inhabit Quirrell's body. He would not push the soul out. And he would share it. He would attach himself to the back of Quirrell's skull, beneath the hair, sustained by Quirrell's life and bodily warmth. Quirrell would wear a turban over the spot to hide it. Anne. The two of them would operate as a single double-headed person, with Voldemort doing the thinking and Quirrell doing the moving. Quirrell believed at the start that he was getting the better end of the deal. He was getting power. He was getting magical knowledge that no Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher in Britain had ever possessed. He thought he could leave the arrangement when he wanted to. He could not. Voldemort settled into the back of his head within hours, and from that hour onward, Quirrell did not have a private thought. They came back to Britain, in the autumn of 1990, Quirrell applied for and was given the Defense Against the Dark Arts post for the following school year. He turned up at Hogwarts in September 1991, wearing a heavy purple turban and stammering more severely than before, and explained that he had picked up the turban in Albania as a gift from a grateful African prince, and the stammer from a frightening encounter with a vampire, and the staff accepted these explanations without much examination, because Quirrell had always been peculiar. Dumbledore looked at him over the high table on the first night of term and frowned slightly, and said nothing. He did not, at that point, know what was wrong. He knew something was. He decided to watch. While Quirrell was settling into his new post, the master inside his turban was making other plans. He had decided that the most efficient way to regain a full body, to climb back out of his current arrangement and become himself again, was to obtain the Philosopher's Stone. The stone was a magical object created by the alchemist Nicola Flamel in the medieval period. It produced two things. It produced gold from base metal in any quantity desired. It produced the elixir of life, which would extend the drinker's lifespan indefinitely. Flamel had used it in modest fashion for several centuries. He and his wife Perenelle had lived past 600 years of age. Flamel was a personal friend of Dumbledore's. Dumbledore had been the one who had identified, in the autumn of 1991, that the stone was now in danger of being stolen, that an unknown party was actively seeking it, and that the safest place for it was inside Hogwarts itself, protected by a series of obstacles set by the staff. Flamel had agreed to give the stone to Dumbledore for safekeeping. The stone was placed inside the school in October. By December, Quirrell was already moving through the castle at night, looking for the route to it. On the last day of July, 1991, in a small house on a Surrey street, a green-eyed boy with a lightning scar received a letter delivered by an owl. It informed him that he had been accepted to attend a school he had never heard of. He read the letter many times. His uncle tore it up. More letters came. Anne. Eventually, the boy was taken away from his aunt and uncle by a half-giant on a flying motorcycle, and he learned, in a single weekend, the entire history of the wizarding world that had been kept from him for 10 years. He learned the name of the man who had killed his parents. He learned what the scar on his forehead meant. He learned that the wizard who had done it was generally believed to be dead. He understood vaguely that he was famous. He did not, in his first months at school, entirely understand what for. He arrived at Hogwarts on the 1st of September 1991, and he was sorted into Gryffindor, in the great surprise of the assembled student body, because the sorting hat had been about to put him in Slytherin, and he had asked it not to, and the hat had, on consideration, agreed. He sat at the long Gryffindor table, and he ate his first proper hot meal in months. He looked up at the high table. He saw the staff for the first time. His eyes met the eyes of a man at the far end of the table, with greasy black hair and a hooked nose, and for a single instant his scar prickled sharply, and he flinched. He looked away. He did not understand it. He went on with dinner. It was not Snape who had made his scar prickle. It was the man next to Snape, a nervous young man in a purple turban. Part 8. The Return begins, 1991 to 1994. For most of the year that Harry Potter spent in his first year at Hogwarts, the wizarding world's most wanted dead man was a few feet from him at most major school events, sharing a body with the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, and wearing a turban over the spot where his face was. Voldemort did almost nothing the first half of the autumn. He was busy planning how to reach the Philosopher's Stone. The stone was inside the school, in a chamber on the third-floor corridor, guarded by a series of obstacles that the senior staff had set in place. Quirrell had to get past every single obstacle to reach it. Until he did, the master in his head could not become himself again. On the night of Halloween, 1991, 10 years to the day after the attack on Godric's Hollow, Quirrell pulled his first major move. He let a mountain troll into the school. The troll was an enormous, clumsy, brain-fogged creature that he had been keeping somewhere in the dungeons. He stood up at the Halloween feast and ran into the Great Hall, shouting that there was a troll in the dungeons. While the school was being evacuated, Quirrell slipped away from the chaos and made his way to the third floor. He got past the three-headed dog at the trapdoor by playing a flute, because the dog could be put to sleep by music. He went down into the chamber below. He found very quickly that the obstacles further in were beyond him. He went back upstairs no closer to the stone than he had been before, and arrived in the great hall in time to faint dramatically for the staff. 3 first-year students were missing from the head count. Anne. They were the boy with the scar and his 2 new friends, who had managed to get separated from the rest of their year and had stumbled into the same room as the troll and somehow defeated it together. They came in at the end with bits of troll snot on their robes and a story that the staff accepted without too many questions. Quirrell looked at the 3 of them with what would later be remembered as an expression of intense calculation. The master in his head had registered their existence. Through the autumn term, Quirrell tried again. He attempted to get past the trapdoor obstacles several more times, with diminishing results. In November, during a Quidditch match, he tried a different tack. He jinxed Harry's broom, attempting to throw the boy off and end the matter directly. Snape spotted him from the stands and counter-jinxed Harry's broom to keep it steady, which Harry did not know at the time. Harry caught the snitch in his mouth. Quirrell left the stands quickly. The master in his head was furious. Snape, in those months, had become a problem. Snape had begun to suspect Quirrell. Anne. Snape was the only other Death Eater on the staff, although nobody in the staff room knew this, and Snape had a finely tuned sense for when someone else in a room was hiding something dark. He had begun watching Quirrell. He had cornered him in an empty classroom one evening and told him, in a low-intent voice, that he knew Quirrell was up to something and that Quirrell would do well to remember which side of the school he was meant to be on. Quirrell had stammered through a denial. Snape had walked away. After that, Quirrell was careful around him. Snape continued to look unfailingly suspicious in the eyes of the 3 first-year students, who had concluded by Christmas that Snape was the one going after the stone, and that the only adult in the school they could trust was the cheerful, nervous Professor Quirrell. The final attempt came at the end of the school year. Voldemort had decided that Quirrell was going to make a complete run at the obstacles, all in one night, and either bring back the stone or fail and be replaced. Quirrell drugged the 3-headed dog. He passed the Devil's Snare, the giant chess set, the troll, and the Room of Flying Keys. He sat down at the table of 7 potion bottles and worked out which of them would let him pass the wall of black fire. He went through. He arrived in the final chamber. He found himself standing in front of the Mirror of Erised, an ancient mirror that had been placed there by Dumbledore as the last and most elegant of the protections. The mirror showed any wizard who looked into it the deepest desire of their own heart. And Dumbledore had bewitched it so that only a person who wanted the stone without wanting to use it, who wanted to find it but not benefit from it, could retrieve it from inside the glass. Anne. Quirrell stood in front of the mirror and could not get the stone out. The mirror showed him being congratulated by his master. It showed him handing the stone to Voldemort. The stone did not come into his pocket. He stood there, with his turban damp from his own sweat, growing more frantic by the second. The first-year boy was already in the chamber by then. He had got past the obstacles in front of Quirrell with help from his friends, who had stayed behind on each one. He had arrived to stop what he believed was Snape's attempt at the stone, only to find Quirrell instead. He stood in the doorway. Quirrell heard him. Quirrell ordered him forward, made him stand in front of the mirror, and asked him what he saw. What Harry saw was himself, holding the stone and slipping the stone into his pocket. The stone appeared in his pocket. He could feel it. Anne. He told Quirrell that he saw himself winning the Quidditch Cup, which was not the truth, and was just clear-headed enough to be a useful lie. Quirrell did not believe him. Quirrell heard the voice of his master coming up through his own throat, telling him to use the boy, to let him face the mirror himself, to demand the truth. The voice in his throat was loud enough that Harry could now hear it too. Harry asked who was speaking. Quirrell answered by removing his turban. The back of Quirrell's head was a face. It was a thin chalk-white face with red eyes and slit nostrils. Lord Voldemort, what was left of him at that point in his existence, was a face on the back of a man. He looked at Harry. He spoke to him directly for the first time in either of their lives. He asked Harry to hand over the stone. Anne. He told Harry that they had things in common, that they were both half-bloods, that they were both orphans, that they could be useful to each other. He told Harry that he could bring his parents back from death if Harry would only cooperate. Harry refused. He turned and ran. Quirrell threw a curse at him and locked the door. Voldemort ordered Quirrell to seize the boy. Quirrell reached out a hand and took Harry by the wrist. He began to burn. The skin of his hand blistered and then split. Quirrell screamed and let go. He went for Harry's throat, and his fingers came away with chunks of skin missing. Whatever Lily Potter's sacrifice had built into her son 10 years earlier was still working. Quirrell could not touch him without his body giving way. Voldemort screamed at Quirrell to keep going. Quirrell tried. Harry, in the chaos of the moment, grabbed at Quirrell's face with both of his small hands. The face dissolved under his fingers. Quirrell collapsed. The body that had carried Voldemort for the past year crumbled into something the size and shape of a man, and then into nothing at all. Anne. The soul fragment that had been living in the back of Quirrell's head went straight up through the ceiling of the chamber. It went east, it went home. It was back in the Albanian forest before midsummer, possessing snakes again, and it was clear to Voldemort, in whatever capacity he had left for clarity, that he had been beaten by a small first-year boy he had never quite finished killing 11 years before, and that the matter was not finished, and that next time the approach would have to be different. The stone was destroyed shortly afterward. Flamel and Dumbledore agreed it was no longer safe to leave in the world. Flamel and his wife Perenelle put their affairs in order and drank the last of the elixir of life, and went to sleep one final time at 665 years of age. Quirrell's funeral was a quiet matter at Hogwarts. The staff did not know exactly what had happened in the chamber. Dumbledore told them what he chose to tell them. He told Harry, in the hospital wing afterward, that the protection of his mother's love was the reason Quirrell had not been able to touch him, and that this protection would last for as long as Harry could call his aunt's house a home. He told him a great many other things too, although he was careful not to tell him the worst of it. In the autumn of 1992, Harry returned for his second year at Hogwarts. Anne. The school year that followed was the worst the school had seen since the early 1940s. A new chapter of the dark magic that had been quietly accumulating at the school was about to open. It opened because of a small black diary that Lucius Malfoy slipped into the cauldron of a young Weasley girl named Ginny at the bookshop Flourish, and blots in Diagon Alley that August. Lucius had been holding the diary for a decade on the orders he had received from his master in the late 1970s. He had been told to protect it. He had not been told what it was. Anne. He had decided, somewhere in the bitterness of the years that followed Voldemort's fall, that the diary was a useful piece of insurance, and he had decided more recently that he could use it to embarrass the Weasley family, whose patriarch Arthur Weasley had been making trouble for him in the ministry through the Muggle Protection Act. Anne. Lucius did not know that he was placing a Horcrux in the hands of an 11-year-old girl. He thought he was placing a propaganda tool. The mistake would cost his master most of a year of operations and would, in some senses, never be forgiven. Ginny Weasley found the diary in her cauldron and assumed it belonged to her. She began to write in it. The diary wrote back. The voice that wrote back was charming. It identified itself as Tom Riddle, a former Hogwarts student. It listened to Ginny's troubles, of which an 11-year-old new student at Hogwarts has many. It comforted her. It gave her advice. It became, in the lonely first weeks of term, her closest confidant. She wrote in it for hours every night. Each time she wrote, a small piece of her own consciousness leaked into the diary, and a small piece of the diary's stored consciousness leaked into her. The leak was Voldemort's invention. The diary contained the 16-year-old fragment of his soul. The longer Ginny used it, the more that fragment grew at her expense. By the autumn of that year, the diary was using Ginny. She was losing whole stretches of time. She would come back to herself, with paint on her hands and feathers on her robes, and no memory of the previous several hours. The Chamber of Secrets reopened. The basilisk, woken after 50 years of sleep, began moving through the pipes again. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, was found petrified on the second floor. A first-year boy named Colin Creevy was petrified on a stairway. A Hufflepuff named Justin Finch-Fletchley was petrified by the basilisk reflected in a pool of water, alongside the ghost of nearly headless Nick, who could not be killed twice but who was visibly singed by the exposure. A Ravenclaw prefect named Penelope Clearwater was petrified beside Hermione Granger, the brightest student in Harry's year, when the two of them, looking around a corner with a hand mirror, met the basilisk's gaze in the glass. Anne. The school was in a panic by the spring. The parents of the Muggle-born students were withdrawing their children. The ministry was breathing on the headmaster. Lucius Malfoy used his position on the Board of Governors to have Dumbledore suspended from his post. Hagrid, who had been an obvious suspect during the previous opening of the chamber, was taken to Azkaban as a precaution. Neither Dumbledore nor Hagrid would be gone for long. But in the days they were absent, the situation grew worse. Ginny disappeared. She had been taken into the chamber by the diary that had nearly drained her. The diary had written a message on the corridor wall in blood, declaring that her bones would lie in the chamber forever. Harry and Ron found the entrance behind the same stone sink that Tom Riddle had used 50 years earlier. Anne. They went down. Their defense against the dark arts teacher, the celebrity author Gilderoy Lockhart, had been forced down with them and had tried to escape using Ron's broken wand and had been hit with his own backfired memory charm and left at the entrance with no idea of his own name. Harry pressed on alone. He found Ginny lying on the floor of the great chamber at the foot of the statue of Slytherin, fading. Beside her stood a tall, dark-haired 16-year-old boy in old-fashioned Hogwarts robes. The boy was Tom Riddle, made solid by the energy he had taken out of Ginny. He smiled at Harry. He told him a great deal of useful information very freely, because he intended to kill him within the hour and did not see the harm. He told Harry that the diary contained him, that he had been writing in it for 50 years, that he had been guiding Ginny into the chamber for months. He told him about Hagrid's framing 50 years earlier. He told him that he had built himself out of his current name, and that Tom Marvolo Riddle was an anagram, for I am Lord Voldemort. And he waved his wand in the air and let the letters of his old and new names rearrange themselves in flame. He summoned the basilisk. Harry should have died in the next 10 minutes. He survived because of a single arrival. Fawkes, the phoenix who lived in Dumbledore's office, flew down into the chamber carrying the sorting hat in his claws. The phoenix attacked the basilisk's eyes, blinding it. Harry pulled the sword of Gryffindor out of the sorting hat. He drove the sword up through the roof of the basilisk's mouth. The fang of the basilisk drove down through his own arm in the same motion. The basilisk fell and died. Harry was poisoned with one of the most lethal venoms in the magical world. He had perhaps a minute to live. Fawkes landed beside him and wept onto the wound. Phoenix tears are the only known antidote to basilisk venom. The wound closed. Harry stood up. He walked across the chamber floor. He picked up the diary. He drove the basilisk fang through it. The diary screamed. Ink poured out of the hole in the cover. The image of Tom Riddle that had been standing across the chamber was thrown back, and his solid body burst with light, and he was destroyed. The first Horcrux had been destroyed, although nobody in that chamber, including Harry, understood at that moment what had really happened. They thought they had only destroyed a memory in a book. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that had been bound inside the diary was now gone from the world. Voldemort, who was still drifting in the Albanian forest in the body of a snake, did not feel the loss directly. He would not understand it for some time. He had lost 1/7 of the soul magic that kept him tethered to life. He did not know. Lucius Malfoy understood, more or less, what had happened. Harry confronted him in Dumbledore's office afterward with the destroyed diary, and Lucius's face did not move. But underneath it, he understood that he had lost something his master would not have forgiven him for losing. He left the office. Harry handed Lucius's house elf, Dobby, a single sock, which was the freedom token by which a house elf can be released from servitude. Lucius lost his elf as well as his diary in the space of an afternoon. He went home that evening, in a worse temper than usual. The third year passed, from Voldemort's point of view, almost entirely without incident. He was still in Albania. He was still in snakes. The only event of that year that touched his story directly was the escape of Sirius Black from Azkaban. Black had been in the prison for 12 years by then. He had survived where most of his fellow inmates had gone mad because he carried, in the back of his mind, a piece of information the Dementors could not feed on. He knew he was innocent. The Dementors fed on happy memories. They could not consume the kind of cold certainty that Sirius held. He kept his mind intact. Anne. He had also, in his 12th year, seen on the cover of a Daily Prophet brought into the prison by Cornelius Fudge a photograph of the Weasley family in Egypt, in the foreground of which, perched on the shoulder of one of the boys, was a small rat with a missing toe on its front paw. Sirius had recognized the rat. He had known what to do. He had transformed into his animagus form and slipped through the bars of his cell and swum to the mainland. He travelled south as a large black dog. He arrived in the area of Hogwarts in the autumn of 1993. He had one objective: find Pettigrew. Finish what should have been finished 12 years earlier in the Muggle Street in London. The events of that year are properly the story of Sirius Black, and we will not dwell on them in detail tonight. What matters for our purposes is the end. Sirius cornered Pettigrew in the Shrieking Shack outside Hogwarts in early summer. Harry and Ron and Hermione were present. So was Remus Lupin, the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, who had been Sirius's friend at school, and who was on the side a werewolf. Sirius and Lupin together forced Pettigrew out of his rat form and confronted him with what he had done. Pettigrew confessed under duress. He cried, he grovelled. Anne. Sirius and Lupin were about to kill him when Harry intervened and asked them not to, because the death of Pettigrew at that moment would have meant Sirius could never be exonerated. Instead, they decided to take Pettigrew alive to the Ministry. They left the Shrieking Shack together. The full moon rose. Lupin transformed before they reached the castle. In the chaos that followed, Pettigrew slipped back into his rat form and escaped down a drain. Sirius escaped too on the back of a hippogriff named Buckbeak. He went into hiding abroad. Pettigrew, with his last clear thought, decided that the only place left in the world where he might be safe was beside his old master. He travelled east. He spent the autumn of 1993 crossing Europe by night bus and walking. By the spring of 1994, he was in the Albanian forest. He found the snake that contained the soul of Voldemort. He spoke. He told his master that he had returned. Voldemort had not forgotten Pettigrew. Pettigrew had, in his estimation, ruined a great many things by his cowardice over the years. Voldemort still had use for him. He set Pettigrew a series of tasks. The first was to capture a ministry employee named Bertha Jorkins, who had been holidaying in Albania that summer, and to bring her to him. Pettigrew did so. Voldemort tortured Bertha Jorkins for several days for the information she had. She knew as it happened a great deal that was useful. She had stumbled across, in the course of her career, the fact that Barty Crouch Jr. was still alive, hidden in his father's house, under the Imperious Curse and an invisibility cloak. She had been memory charmed by Crouch Sr. to make her forget. The charm broke under the Cruciatus. Anne, she told everything. Voldemort then killed her, because she had no further use, and the soul fragment in his snake body grew slightly stronger from the murder. He was beginning to recover some clarity. With the information Bertha had given them, Voldemort and Pettigrew put together the plan that would bring him back. They needed 3 ingredients for the rebirth ritual. They had identified, in old necromantic texts, a piece of magic that could rebuild a body around the soul fragment Voldemort still possessed, provided the fragment could be placed inside a temporary infant-like form first. The recipe required, among other things, the bone of the father of the wizard being reborn, taken without his knowledge from his grave. It required the flesh of a servant given willingly. It required the blood of an enemy taken by force. The plan was to use the bone of Tom Riddle Sr., who was still buried in the village cemetery at Little Hangleton, the flesh of Pettigrew himself, who would have to cut off a part of his own body for the spell, and the blood of Harry Potter, who would have to be brought to them somehow at the precise moment of the ritual. Pettigrew built his master a rudimentary body that summer, using dark potions and the milk of unicorns and the venom of Nagini, a great serpent Voldemort had encountered in the forest and bound to himself as a personal familiar. The body was not large. It was the size of a small child, with red eyes and white skin and a thin-scaled tail in place of legs. It was hideous. It could not survive on its own. It had to be carried, fed and tended. Pettigrew and Nagini and the small infant Voldemort travelled west out of Albania in the late summer of 1994. They came to the village of Little Hangleton. They came to the manor house at the top of the hill, which had been empty for 50 years. The Riddles had all died on the night Tom had killed them. Anne. The estate had passed through several distant cousins who had never lived in the house. It was being kept by an elderly Muggle gardener named Frank Bryce, who lived in a small cottage on the grounds and walked the lawns at night. Frank Bryce was killed by Voldemort. One evening in August, he had heard voices in the upper rooms of the manor. He had gone up to investigate. He had found, in the front parlour, a small bundle in an armchair, and a fat, hairless man at the fire, and an enormous snake on the carpet. He had heard the bundle in the armchair say, "Kill him." Pettigrew had raised his wand. Frank had died standing up. The body lay in the parlour for several weeks before anyone came to look for him. And Harry, 300 miles away in Surrey, had woken from the dream that had given him the entire scene through the link in his scar, sat up in bed in the dark, and pressed his hand to his forehead, because his scar was burning for the first time since the moment of his mother's death. The Triwizard Tournament was being held at Hogwarts that year. It had not been held in a century. The Ministry had revived it as a piece of international goodwill. 3 schools were participating: Beauxbatons from France, Durmstrang from Northern Europe, and Hogwarts. Each school would nominate a single champion through the Goblet of Fire, an ancient magical artifact, and the 3 champions would compete in 3 tasks across the year for 1,000 galleon prize and the Triwizard Cup. Anne. The plan that Voldemort and Pettigrew put together that summer used the tournament. The man Bertha Jorkins had given them, Barty Crouch Jr., was broken out of his father's house with the help of Voldemort and Pettigrew, transported north, and given the assignment of impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, the new defense against the dark arts teacher Dumbledore had hired for the year. Moody was kidnapped in the early autumn and locked in his own enchanted trunk. Crouch Jr. took a year-long supply of polyjuice potion, brewed with hairs from the real Moody, and went to Hogwarts in his place. Nobody noticed. Crouch Jr. put Harry's name in the goblet under a 4th school, which forced the goblet to choose Harry as a 4th Triwizard champion. Crouch Jr. then spent the entire school year shepherding Harry through the 3 tasks of the tournament, helping him in every possible way, because the prize at the end of the 3rd task was a portkey that Crouch Jr. had quietly enchanted. The Triwizard Cup itself was the portkey. Whoever touched it would be transported directly to the cemetery at Little Hangleton. Crouch Jr. wanted to ensure that the one who reached it was Harry. The 3rd task came on the evening of the 24th of June, 1995. The champions entered a vast hedge maze on the Quidditch pitch. Harry and Cedric Diggory, the Hogwarts champion, reached the centre of the maze together. Anne. They had helped each other through several obstacles. They had decided, with a generosity uncharacteristic of competitive Triwizard tournaments, to take the cup together. They reached down at the same time. They both touched it. They were both transported. They landed in the cemetery. Cedric Diggory, a 17-year-old Hufflepuff with a kind face and a fiancée in Ravenclaw, said the words, "Where are we?" Voldemort's voice came out of the dark behind a yew tree and said the words, "Kill the spare." Pettigrew killed Cedric with a single curse. Cedric fell on the grass between the tombstones, surprised, his eyes open. He was dead before his body settled. Pettigrew tied Harry to the gravestone of Tom Riddle Sr. He cut the cauldron from his belt and set it up in the grass. He poured potions into it. He took bone dust from Riddle Sr.'s grave by magic and dropped it in. He cut off his own right hand and dropped it in. He took a long curved knife and cut a deep gash across Harry's arm and let the blood drip into the cauldron. The potion in the cauldron turned white. The infant body of Voldemort, that had been resting in the grass beside the cauldron, was lifted in and lowered down. There was a long moment of silence. Steam rose. The cauldron grew hot, and out of the steam, very slowly, a tall, pale, thin man stood up. He stretched his arms. He flexed the long, thin fingers. He stepped out of the cauldron onto the wet earth. He was 13 years gone from the world, and he was back. He was 58 years old by then, in terms of calendar years. He looked, in his new body, like a man who had never quite been human. The nose was flat and slit. The eyes were red. The skin was the colour of a fish kept in a jar. The hair was gone. He looked at Harry on the gravestone. He smiled. He pressed his bare arm down on the dark mark on Pettigrew's wrist. The dark marks of every Death Eater in Britain burned. Within minutes, the dark robes and silver masks were appearing in the cemetery, summoned to the side of a master most of them had not seen in 14 years. They came in ones and twos. They knelt. He walked among them. He noted, in mild, dry voice, the ones who were missing. He noted that Lucius Malfoy had not turned up among the first wave. Although Lucius came eventually, he noted, with sharper attention, that 2 faces were absent altogether. Karkaroff, who had fled the country years before, was missing and had to be hunted down. The other absence was the one that mattered. Severus Snape was not there. Snape at that moment was at Hogwarts. He had felt the mark burn. He had not gone. Voldemort untied Harry from the gravestone. He returned his wand to him. He insisted, with elaborate courtesy, on a proper duel. Harry, on shaking legs, raised his wand. The 2 of them cast at the same time. Harry's Expelliarmus met Voldemort's killing curse halfway across the cemetery, and where the spells touched, a golden thread sprang up between the 2 wands and held them together. Neither could move. The wands recognized each other. The Yew wand and the Holly wand were brother wands, their cores both from the same phoenix, and they would not duel against each other to the death. The thread of light held. Up out of Voldemort's wand began to emerge, in order, the ghosts of the people the wand had recently killed. The shade of Cedric came first, the shade of Frank Bryce came second, the shade of Bertha Jorkins came third, the shade of Lily Potter came fourth. The shade of James Potter came last, because they were the most recent of his many killings, although they had not died by his current wand, and the connection was a strange one. They formed a ring around Harry. Lily told her son how to use the opening they were about to make. She told him to be ready. James told him they were proud of him. Cedric asked him to take his body back to his father. Harry broke the connection. The shades scattered toward Voldemort, blinding him for a moment. Harry ran. He grabbed Cedric's body. He grabbed the cup. He vanished. He landed in the maze on the lawn at Hogwarts at midnight, holding the corpse of Cedric Diggory in one hand and the Triwizard Cup in the other, screaming in a voice that the staff of the school would remember for the rest of their lives. Voldemort was back in his body. The wizarding world, although it would not believe it for another year, was at war again. Part 9. The Second War Rising, 1994 to 1997. The Ministry of Magic did not believe Harry Potter when he told them what had happened in the graveyard. Anne. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, had been in office for several years and had grown comfortable in the position, and the news that Voldemort had returned to a full body was the worst possible news for any government in power. It implied a war Fudge had no plans for. It implied that the Ministry had failed to detect the most dangerous wizard alive moving back into Britain over the course of a year, and it implied that Fudge was going to be the minister presiding over a second wizarding war, with everything that meant in terms of public reputation and historical legacy. Fudge looked at all of this from his office in Whitehall, and he decided to refuse to believe it. He told the press that Harry Potter had become unstable. He told the press that Dumbledore was old and tired and had begun making strange political claims. He told them that the Triwizard Tournament had been a tragic accident, that Cedric Diggory's death had been a sad and unrelated event, that there was no reason to panic. The Daily Prophet, which was largely under Ministry editorial control, repeated this line for the next 12 months. Harry was painted in print as an attention-seeking teenager. Dumbledore was painted as senile, the wizarding public, who wanted very much to believe the war was not coming back, largely accepted the version they were being sold. Voldemort, in the same months, used the Year of Denial as cover. He kept his return quiet. He did not stage any large public attacks. Anne. He let the Death Eaters who had come to him in the graveyard go quietly home to their houses and resume their previous lives, with the addition of weekly intelligence reports filed back to him at Malfoy Manor, which had become his temporary base. He focused instead on a specific objective: Anne. He had become obsessed, during the years of his disembodied wandering, with the substance of the prophecy that had sent him to Godric's Hollow in the first place. Snape had only heard the first half of it. Voldemort had never been told the second half, because the eavesdropping had been interrupted before the prophecy was finished. He had been operating for 20 years on incomplete information. He wanted now to hear the whole thing. The prophecy itself, in its physical form as a small glass orb, was stored in the Department of Mysteries inside the Ministry of Magic, on a shelf with millions of others. Only the people the prophecy was about could take it from the shelf. Voldemort could not enter the Ministry without revealing his return. He needed Harry to enter the Ministry instead, find the orb, take it down, and bring it out. The entire campaign of the autumn and winter of 1995 was a slow, elaborate plan to maneuver Harry into doing exactly that. The Order of the Phoenix was reconstituted in the summer of 1995. Dumbledore had been quietly preparing for the contingency since the night of the graveyard. He moved the headquarters into the ancestral home of the Black family at number 12, Grimmauld Place in London, which Sirius had inherited and which he loathed, and to which he had returned reluctantly after coming out of hiding earlier that summer. The house was dark, dusty, and full of the magical defenses Sirius's family had set into it across 2 centuries. It became the wartime headquarters. The Order's members, the surviving ones from the First War, and the new recruits from the next generation, gathered in the kitchen and made plans. Most of them were sleeping in the upstairs bedrooms. Mad-Eye Moody had been rescued from the trunk. Crouch Jr. had locked him in. Remus Lupin was back in service. Nymphadora Tonks, a young Auror and Sirius's cousin, had joined. Kingsley Shacklebolt, another Auror, had joined. Bill Weasley, Charlie Weasley, and Arthur Weasley were all members. Molly was running the kitchen. Snape continued his role as a double agent, attending some meetings in person and feeding information in both directions. The Ministry's denial campaign had a tactical consequence. The Ministry decided that the way to manage Hogwarts during the supposed crisis was to install a Ministry inspector inside the school. The inspector who was sent was a witch named Dolores Umbridge, who took the post of defense against the dark arts professor, and then, by Ministry decree, the additional post of High Inquisitor, with the power to inspect and discipline the rest of the staff. Umbridge was a short, pink cardigan-wearing, kitten plate-collecting woman who had risen in the Ministry by being a particularly effective enforcer of unpleasant policies. She ran her classroom on the strict prohibition of any actual practical magic. The students were not to cast spells. They were to read about spells. They were to memorize theoretical descriptions of spells. They were not, in any circumstances, to practice spells in case any of them grew confident enough to think for themselves. Harry, who had spent the previous year being told he was a liar, picked his fights with Umbridge from the first week. He was given detention almost weekly. The detentions involved writing lines with a special quill that drew the words from the writer's own blood and cut them into the back of the writer's hand. Harry came out of his detentions with the words "I must not tell lies" carved across the back of his right hand. He never reported the quill. He did not want Umbridge to know she had got to him. A small group of students at the school decided, that autumn, to teach themselves what Umbridge would not teach. They called the group Dumbledore's Army. They met in the room of requirement on the 7th floor, in the same chamber where a diadem with a Horcrux inside it had been sitting on a shelf for half a century. They practiced spells. Harry taught them. By Christmas they could cast the Patronus charm. By Easter they could disarm and stun in combat patterns. Umbridge eventually found them, with the help of a Slytherin student named Cho Chang's friend, who was being blackmailed. The group was broken up. Dumbledore took the blame for it on himself in front of the Ministry inspectors to protect Harry, and was forced to flee the school. Umbridge took over as headmistress in his absence. The school descended further into a kind of low-level, pink-walled hell that the older students remembered, years later, with a degree of unhappy clarity that suggested the wartime trauma of that year was as deep as anything that came in later. Voldemort's plan ripened in the spring. He had been feeding Harry dreams through their scar connection for months. He had been planting images of the corridor leading to the Department of Mysteries. He had been guiding the boy toward the Hall of Prophecy without the boy understanding what he was being guided toward. In the final week of the school year, he planted the false vision that completed the trap. He showed Harry an image of Sirius being tortured by Voldemort himself inside the Department of Mysteries. The image was a fabrication. Sirius was at Grimmauld Place, safe. Harry believed it. He took 5 friends with him and flew to London on the backs of the Strolls to rescue his godfather. The battle in the Department of Mysteries, on the night of the 18th of June, 1996, was the worst piece of fighting that any of the 6 children involved had ever seen. They went down into the Hall of Prophecy. Harry took the prophecy orb off the shelf, because Voldemort had calculated correctly that only Harry could remove it. The Death Eaters, who had been hiding in the shadows, surrounded them. Lucius Malfoy was there. Bellatrix Lestrange was there, recently broken out of Azkaban, along with the other senior Death Eaters in a mass escape Voldemort had organized that winter. So were Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, Augustus Rookwood, and several others. The Death Eaters asked Harry to hand over the prophecy. He refused. The fight began. The 6 teenagers held their own for several minutes against 10 experienced dark wizards, which was a small miracle and a credit to the defense against the dark arts training Harry had been giving them since October. Several of them were injured. Hermione was hit by a curse from Dolohov and almost died on the spot. The Order arrived in time to turn the tide. Lupin, Tonks, Kingsley, Moody and Sirius all apparated into the lower chamber and joined the fight. Sirius engaged with Bellatrix at the foot of a raised stone dais that held an ancient stone arch hung with a tattered veil. Bellatrix and her cousin Sirius had not seen each other in years. They duelled on the dais. Sirius laughed at something Bellatrix said. Bellatrix struck him square in the chest with a curse, and the force of it pushed him backward, and he stumbled, and he fell back through the veil. The veil rippled. Sirius did not come out of it. Nobody before or since has stepped through that arch and returned. He was gone. Harry tried to follow him. Lupin held him back. The fight continued. Eventually, Lucius Malfoy was disarmed and arrested. Bellatrix fled into the upper ministry, and Harry followed her, and they ducked and dodged through the marble atrium of the Ministry of Magic, with Harry trying to cast the Cruciatus curse on her in his rage, and not having the heart for it. At the foot of the central fountain of the Ministry, Voldemort himself arrived, to finish what Bellatrix had been unable to. He yelled Harry directly. Then, before Harry could fall, Dumbledore arrived too. Dumbledore and Voldemort duelled in the atrium for several minutes. They threw curses at each other that the Ministry walls were not built to absorb. The golden statues in the central fountain animated themselves at Dumbledore's command and joined the fight on his side. Voldemort, who had been planning to kill Harry but who recognized that Dumbledore was about to win, threw himself bodily into Harry's mind and tried to possess him. He had not done this since his Albanian forest days. The possession did not take. Whatever protection Harry's mother had built into him 16 years earlier was still working, and the love of Sirius, fresh in Harry's grief, was sharp enough to repel the soul fragment Voldemort had tried to push into him. Voldemort pulled back. Dumbledore stood with his wand raised. Voldemort apparated away, taking Bellatrix with him. He left behind one fatal mistake. Cornelius Fudge had arrived in the atrium at the same moment that Voldemort apparated out. Fudge saw him. So did half a dozen Ministry officials and several reporters. The denial campaign collapsed. Anne. The Daily Prophet ran the headline, "Who Must Not Be Named returns the next morning," with a photograph of the wreckage of the atrium and a small panel image of Voldemort himself, captured by a journalist camera in the half-second before he disapparated. Fudge resigned within weeks. The new minister was Rufus Scrimgeour, a former senior Auror, hard-edged, no-nonsense, and entirely outmatched by what he had been handed. The war was officially on. The ministry had lost a year denying it. The Order had spent that year preparing. Voldemort had not waited politely for either side to be ready. The autumn of 1996 began Voldemort's most aggressive year. He no longer needed to hide. He attacked openly. The Brockdale Bridge, a major Muggle commuter route over the Thames, was magically severed in the middle of rush hour, killing dozens of Muggles in the cars that fell into the river. Anne. The Death Eaters were under instructions to attack Muggle infrastructure freely, because Voldemort had concluded that Muggle terror would put political pressure on the Ministry through the news media. The strategy worked. The wizarding press began running daily disappearance lists, weekly massacre reports, and obituary pages so long they spilled across multiple sheets. Bones, the new head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the surviving sister of Edgar Bones, who had been murdered 15 years earlier in the First War, was killed in her own home by Voldemort personally. Florian Fortescue, the kindly owner of the ice cream parlor in Diagon Alley, was kidnapped and never seen again. Garrick Ollivander, the wand maker, was kidnapped and held in the cellar of Malfoy Manor. The wizarding world, which had grown comfortable across 15 years of peace, was unmaking itself in a matter of months. Voldemort had also begun, in the same season, a project of personal magic that would take him most of the year. He had concluded, after the Department of Mysteries battle, that the wand he was carrying could not be used directly against Harry. The Brother Cause would not allow it. He needed a different wand. He needed specifically the most powerful wand in the world, the Elder Wand, Anne. He had heard the old legends about it, the same legends Harry would later hear from Xenophilius Lovegood, but he had not previously cared about them, because he had thought the legends were folklore. After the failure in the atrium, he reconsidered. He began hunting the Elder Wand. He had a lead. He had been told that the wand had most recently belonged to a wandmaker named Gregorovich. He went after Gregorovich personally. He tortured him. He learned that the wand had been stolen from Gregorovich's workshop years earlier by a young blonde-haired thief. The thief turned out, after further investigation, to have been Gellert Grindelwald, who had taken the wand long before Voldemort had been born. Voldemort traced the line forward from there. The next step would take him most of the school year to puzzle out. While Voldemort was hunting the Elder Wand abroad, the situation at Hogwarts in the school year of 1996 to 1997 had its own crisis developing. Draco Malfoy, the son of Lucius, had been given an assignment by Voldemort over the summer. His father had failed at the Department of Mysteries and was in Azkaban. Voldemort, as a punishment to the family, had assigned the family's only son the task of killing Albus Dumbledore. The assignment was given with the understanding that Draco was almost certain to fail. It was a punishment dressed as an honor. Narcissa Malfoy, Draco's mother, understood this perfectly. In late summer, she went to Severus Snape and asked him to help her son. She asked Snape, in fact, to take on the assignment if Draco proved unable to complete it. Snape agreed. He sealed the agreement with an unbreakable vow, witnessed by Bellatrix Lestrange. From that moment, Snape was bound by the magic of the vow to kill Dumbledore if Draco failed. Either Snape would do it, or Snape would die. What none of the three witches and wizards present at that conversation knew was that Snape had already received instructions from Dumbledore on exactly this scenario. Dumbledore, the previous summer, had retrieved the Ring of the Gaunts from beneath the floor of the shack in Little Hangleton. He had identified the ring as a Horcrux. He had destroyed it with the Sword of Gryffindor, the same sword that had destroyed the basilisk. But the ring had been protected by Voldemort with a powerful curse. Dumbledore had set off the curse in the act of putting the ring on his own finger, which he had done in a brief moment of weakness when he had glimpsed the resurrection stone set into the band and had been struck for a single second by the possibility of seeing his dead sister and his dead family again. Snape had saved his life, just barely, by containing the curse to his right hand. The hand was blackened and dying. Anne. The curse would, over the course of the following year, work its way up Dumbledore's arm and into his heart. Dumbledore had perhaps a year to live at most. He had told Snape this. He had asked Snape, when the time came, to be the one to kill him. He had argued that a planned death would be cleaner than a slow, agonizing one. He had argued, more importantly, that if Snape killed him at the climax of Draco's task, Snape would be confirmed in Voldemort's eyes as the most loyal of all Death Eaters, and Snape would be free to continue spying as the secret head of the Order. Snape had argued back. He had not wanted to do it. Dumbledore had won the argument. The plan was set. Through the school year, Draco worked on his task. He had been smuggled into the school, a means by which to bring his fellow Death Eaters in from outside. Inside an empty classroom on the 7th floor stood a vanishing cabinet, a paired magical object whose twin was in the back room of Borgin and Burke's shop in Nocturne Alley. The two cabinets were a portal. Anything placed in one could travel to the other. If both were working, the cabinet at Hogwarts was broken. Draco spent the autumn and winter and spring trying to repair it. He worked alone, mostly in the room of requirement. He grew thinner. He grew paler. The mask of arrogance he had worn through his earlier years at Hogwarts cracked into something more obviously frightened. Several of his classmates noticed. Harry noticed in particular. Harry spent half the year stalking Draco around the school, trying to figure out what he was doing. Dumbledore, in the same year, was teaching Harry. He had decided that the time had come to give Harry the full picture of what Voldemort was. He pulled Harry into his office for private lessons through the autumn and spring. They watched, in the pensive memories Dumbledore had collected over the years. They watched the Gaunt family in their shack. They watched the orphanage interview. They watched Slughorn's Slug Club. The most important memory, the conversation between 16-year-old Tom Riddle and the young Slughorn about whether a wizard could split his soul more than once, was the one Dumbledore could not, at first, get from Slughorn, because Slughorn had altered the memory in shame and was unwilling to surrender the original. Harry eventually got it, with the help of a small flask of Felix Felicis, the luck potion, won earlier in the year in potions. He cornered Slughorn one evening. He used the potion. He came back to the office with the unaltered memory in a glass vial. Dumbledore watched the memory. He looked at the boy in front of him. He said, with the closest approximation to fear his voice ever achieved, that Voldemort had succeeded. 7 Horcruxes. He listed them as best he could. The diary, destroyed in the chamber. The ring, destroyed by Dumbledore the previous summer. The locket of Slytherin, hidden somewhere in Britain. The cup of Hufflepuff, in some unknown location, very probably guarded by a senior Death Eater. The diadem of Ravenclaw, possibly in some location associated with the school. The snake Nagini, who never left Voldemort's side. And, although Dumbledore did not yet tell Harry this last part, a piece of him in the scar on Harry's forehead. The cave came at the end of the school year. Dumbledore had located, through clues he had pieced together over decades, the sea cave on the coast where the Slytherin locket was hidden. He took Harry with him to retrieve it. The two of them apparated to a cliff above the sea. They climbed down into the cliffside. They crossed the underground lake in the small boat, navigated the Inferi in the water, drank the potion in the basin to clear the alcove, and retrieved the locket. Dumbledore had insisted on being the one to drink the potion. Harry had fed it to him cup by cup, while Dumbledore had begged him to stop, screaming for water and for forgiveness for memories Harry could not see. They came out of the cave on the cliffside above the sea, drenched and exhausted, with Dumbledore barely able to stand. The locket was in Dumbledore's pocket. They apparated to Hogsmeade. The first thing Dumbledore saw above the village was the dark mark, hovering green and serpentine in the sky over the highest tower of the school. They flew up to the tower at once on borrowed brooms. Dumbledore froze Harry under his invisibility cloak in the shadows by the entrance, with a single word he did not have time to explain. He turned to face the door. Draco Malfoy came out. Draco was holding his wand. He had repaired the vanishing cabinet that very evening. He had let the Death Eaters into the school. He had run up to the tower to confront the headmaster he had spent 10 months trying to murder. He disarmed Dumbledore on the spot, before he could think about it, in a moment of reflex. Dumbledore's wand flew out of his hand and clattered to the stone. The wand was the Elder Wand. Draco Malfoy, in that moment, became the true owner of the most powerful wand in the world, and did not know it. Draco hesitated to kill Dumbledore. He stood there with his wand raised. The Death Eaters arrived behind him on the tower. Bellatrix was there. So were Greyback, the Carrows, and a 4th wizard. They taunted Draco. They taunted Dumbledore. Dumbledore spoke to Draco gently. He told him he did not have to do this. He told him there were ways the Order could protect his family. He told him, in his calm, slow voice, that he was not a killer, that Draco Malfoy was not the kind of person who could murder a man in cold blood. Draco's wand wavered. He almost lowered it. The door to the staircase opened again, and Snape came up, alone. He took in the scene. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at him and said the single word, Severus, in a voice that meant several things at once, and Snape understood every one of them. He raised his wand. He spoke the killing curse. Albus Dumbledore was lifted off his feet by the green light, sailed backward over the parapet of the tower, and fell to the dark grass below. The Death Eaters fled. Snape took Draco with him. Anne. They went out through the castle in a running gunfight with the Order members who had arrived too late, and they made it past the wards at the gate, and they apparated away. Harry, frozen under his cloak until the spell wore off when Dumbledore died, came down from the tower in time to chase Snape across the lawn for a few yards before Snape turned and disarmed him too, and shouted at him with something close to grief, that he was not to call Snape a coward, that he was the half-blood prince. He apparated out. The students and staff gathered around Dumbledore's body in the courtyard before dawn. Dumbledore looked in death the way he had looked in life, old and tired and at peace. Harry, that night, opened the locket they had brought back from the cave. Inside it was a note. The note was written in a careful, elegant hand. It said that the locket inside was a fake, that the writer had stolen the real Horcrux many years before and intended to destroy it, and that the writer expected to be dead long before the message was read. It was signed with the initials R.A.B. The initials would take Harry several months to identify. They belonged to Regulus Arcturus Black, Sirius Black's younger brother, a Death Eater who had served Voldemort in the First War for less than a year before deciding to defect. Regulus had figured out in his last months that his master had been making Horcruxes. He had taken his house elf creature to the cave. He had switched the lockets. He had drunk the potion himself, intending creature to take the real Horcrux back to Grimmauld Place and destroy it. The Inferi had pulled Regulus under. Creature had escaped with the locket. He had been unable to destroy it. The Horcrux had sat in the drawing room cabinet at Grimmauld Place for 15 years. Attempted by Sirius to be thrown out during a cleanup in 1995, rescued from the rubbish by Creature, and eventually stolen by Mundungus Fletcher and resold to Dolores Umbridge, who was at that moment wearing it on a chain around her neck inside the Ministry of Magic. Harry, the night of Dumbledore's funeral, told Ron and Hermione that he was not going back to school the next year. He was going to hunt the Horcruxes. He was going to find them and destroy them, and at the end of the line he was going to find Voldemort and finish him. Ron and Hermione told him that they were coming with him. He tried to refuse. They overrode him. Anne. The three of them sat together by the lake at sunset, the morning after the funeral, and watched the merpeople sing under the surface of the water, and made the decision that would shape the next 12 months of their lives. If you have made it this far without falling asleep, you are doing better than most. We are almost at the end now. Anne. If this video has been keeping you company through the night, a quiet like before you drift off helps the channel keep making them. Anne. If there is a particular corner of this story, or of any other wizarding history, you would like covered in a future video, the comments are open. Thank you for spending the night with us. Now the last year, part 10, the final year, 1997 to 1998. The summer of 1997 was the summer of the Ministry's collapse. Rufus Scrimgeour had been in office for a year, and had spent that year trying to fight Voldemort's campaign without ever quite catching up to it. Death Eaters had infiltrated every department of the building. Pius Thickness, the new head of magical law enforcement, was under the Imperious Curse, cast by Yaxley, a senior Death Eater, who had been working inside the Ministry for months. The plan to take the Ministry was rolled out on a single day at the end of July. Scrimgeour was captured at home by Death Eaters and tortured for the location of Harry Potter. He refused to give it. He died refusing. The Death Eaters took control of every senior office in the Ministry within a single afternoon. Pius Thickness was installed as the new minister, with Voldemort, the unspoken authority, behind him. The Daily Prophet, now under Death Eater editorial control, ran the change as a routine government reshuffle. The wizarding world understood, by the end of the next morning, that the war was over and Voldemort had won. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had spent the early summer at the Burrow, attending the wedding of Bill Weasley and Fleur Delacour. The wedding was disrupted in the middle of the dancing by the arrival of Kingsley Shacklebolt's Patronus, in the form of a lynx, which spoke in his voice and announced that the ministry had fallen and the Death Eaters were coming. The wedding broke up in a single panicked second. Harry, Ron and Hermione disapparated together to a Muggle cafe in central London, which was attacked moments later by 2 Death Eaters who had followed them. They fought and won narrowly. They went into hiding at Grimmauld Place. The Order's safe house had been compromised by the loss of Dumbledore as secret keeper, but the Fidelius charm still held thinly enough that the Death Eaters could not find it without a great deal of effort. The 3 of them stayed there for several weeks. They planned. They infiltrated the Ministry of Magic in early September using Polyjuice Potion and stolen identification, found Umbridge, and stole the Slytherin locket from around her neck. They came out of the Ministry alive, with the locket in their possession, but with their cover blown. They could no longer return to Grimmauld Place. They began moving from campsite to campsite across Britain, sleeping in Hermione's magically expanded tent, eating mushrooms and fish they caught themselves. The locket could not be destroyed. They had no idea how to destroy a Horcrux. Hermione had not yet learned that the Basilisk Fang was an option. The Sword of Gryffindor, which Dumbledore had bequeathed to Harry in his will, had been intercepted by the Ministry. They carried the locket in turns on a chain around the neck. The Horcrux fed on whoever wore it. It planted doubt. It planted resentment. It planted small dark feelings that festered into arguments. Ron, who was hungry and worried about his family, and not certain why he was still on the road with 2 friends who seemed to be getting along without him, snapped one rainy evening at the end of autumn and apparated away from the camp. He intended to come straight back. He could not. They had moved camps before he could find his way again. He was lost from the group for several months. He had time in those months to think about what he had done and to hate himself for it. Harry and Hermione went to Godric's Hollow in late December. They wanted to see Harry's parents' grave. They wanted to find Bathilda Bagshot, the historian, who Harry hoped might still have one of Dumbledore's old letters or know something useful about the sword. They visited the cemetery first. They found the gravestone of James and Lily Potter. Hermione conjured flowers. They left them. Anne. They walked through the village and stopped at a small house on the corner that looked, behind its overgrown hedge, like the cottage where the attack had happened 16 years earlier. Bathilda Bagshot's house was just down the street. They knocked at her door. The old woman who answered was not in fact Bathilda Bagshot. She had been dead for weeks. Her body was being inhabited by Nagini, the snake of Voldemort, who had been sent there as a guard in case Harry came looking for the place. The snake-the old woman led Harry upstairs alone. She struck. Harry survived because Hermione came up after them, blasted the wallpaper apart, and apparated the 2 of them out, leaving Harry's Holly and Phoenix feather wand snapped in the wreckage of the bedroom. He never quite repaired that loss. He spent the rest of the year using Hermione's wand, or borrowed wands. Sometime in late winter, while Harry and Hermione were camped in the Forest of Dean, a silver doe appeared between the trees and led Harry to a frozen pool. The doe was a Patronus. He could not see who had cast it. It was Snape, who had been tracking the trio at Dumbledore's posthumous instruction, and who had decided that the time had come to give them the sword. The sword of Gryffindor was at the bottom of the pool, beneath the ice. Harry broke the ice and dove in. The locket, sensing it was about to be destroyed, tried to strangle him underwater. Ron, who had finally found his way back to the camp at exactly the right moment, dove in after him, broke the chain, pulled him out, and helped him retrieve the sword. They destroyed the locket together. The Horcrux inside it released a final cloud of dark images, including a vision of Harry and Hermione together that was deliberately calibrated to break Ron's heart. Ron destroyed it anyway. The locket fell open and the soul fragment screamed and was gone. 3 down, 4 to go. Anne. In the spring, the 3 of them learned the story of the Deathly Hallows from Xenophilius Lovegood. The Hallows were 3 magical objects from an old wizarding tale. The Cloak of Invisibility, which Harry already possessed and had inherited from his father. The Resurrection Stone, which had been set into Marvolo Gaunt's ring, and which Dumbledore had removed before destroying the ring, and had passed to Harry through the snitch he had bequeathed in his will. Although Harry had not yet figured out how to open the snitch, the Elder Wand, which Voldemort was at that moment hunting, and which he believed he had identified as still in the possession of Albus Dumbledore in Dumbledore's tomb at Hogwarts. The full set of 3 Hallows, the legend said, made their owner the Master of Death, Anne. Harry's father had passed the cloak down through generations of Potters going back to the original Peverell brother who had hidden from death. The stone had been passed down the Gaunt line from the second Peverell brother. The wand had been built by the eldest brother and had passed through the centuries on a long, bloody chain of duelists. Voldemort, who had no interest in the legend of the brothers, wanted the wand for its power alone. Harry, in the same spring, found that he wanted all 3 for the chance they offered him to see his dead. The 3 of them were captured by Snatchers in late spring and taken to Malfoy Manor. Bellatrix Lestrange recognized the sword of Gryffindor in their possession. She panicked, because the sword had been in her Gringotts vault, which meant if Harry had it, then someone had been in her vault, which meant the cup might also be at risk. She tortured Hermione in the parlour of the manor for information. Harry and Ron, locked in a cellar with several other prisoners, including Ollivander the Wandmaker and a young goblin named Griffook, attempted a rescue. Anne, their old friend Dobby the house elf, freed by Harry years earlier in the second year, apparated into the cellar with them, broke them out and took them, along with the prisoners, to Bill and Fleur's cottage on the south coast. On the way out of the manor, Bellatrix threw her silver knife. The knife struck Dobby in the chest. He died on the sand of the beach at Shell Cottage some minutes later, with Harry's name on his lips. Harry buried him with his bare hands. A week later, they broke into Gringotts. Griffook led them down through the Wizarding Bank's defences. They entered the Lestrange vault with the help of a stolen wand. They found the cup of Hufflepuff at the back of the vault, behind chests of gold that Bellatrix had not touched in 2 decades. Anne. The vault's protections multiplied any object they touched into burning copies of itself, filling the vault with searing duplicates, and they had to fight their way out through gold that scalded the skin. Anne. They escaped Gringotts on the back of a chained dragon, which they freed from the lower vaults, and flew north to the Highlands. Voldemort, in Britain at the time of the break-in, lost his composure for the first time in living memory. He killed every Death Eater in the room with him, one after another, with the killing curse. Then, in a quieter cold rage, he understood that Harry was hunting his Horcruxes. He went into the minds of his enemies through the Scar Link and confirmed it. He understood, with sudden terrible clarity, that he had to check all of his Horcruxes immediately. He apparated to the cave on the coast. The locket was gone. He apparated to Gringotts. The cup was gone. He apparated to Hogwarts. The diadem, he knew, was somewhere inside the castle. He went to retrieve it. By the time he reached the front gate of the school, Harry, Ron and Hermione had already arrived in Hogsmeade by way of Aberforth Dumbledore, who had received them in the back room of his pub. The Battle of Hogwarts began on the evening of the 1st of May, 1998, and ended at dawn the next morning. The school's defenders had less than 2 hours to prepare. They evacuated the younger students. They sealed the gates. They animated the suits of armour and the stone statues. McGonagall, who had taken over Dumbledore's old role as head of the school, led the defence from the steps of the entrance hall. Slughorn, Flitwick, Sprout, Trelawney, Hagrid, the Order, the surviving members of Dumbledore's army, the Weasleys, the older students who had refused to leave, they held the boundary as long as they could. Voldemort's forces came over the wards in the first hour, giants, acromantulas pouring out of the Forbidden Forest, Death Eaters, werewolves, Inferi rising from the lake. The battle began in the corridors of the school and moved outside and back inside again, and by midnight there were bodies in the entrance hall and the Great Hall and along the staircases. Fred Weasley, the twin brother of George, died in an explosion in a corridor on the 3rd floor. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, who had married the previous summer and had a baby son named Teddy at home with his grandmother, were both killed in the same engagement near a flight of stairs. Colin Creevey, the small boy who had been petrified at 11 years old, snuck back into the school despite being underage and was killed in the 2nd hour of the fighting. Many other students died. Vincent Crabbe, of all people, set fire to the room of requirement using a curse he could not control, called Fiendfire, which consumes anything it touches and is one of the only known means by which a Horcrux can be destroyed. The fire took the diadem of Ravenclaw with it. The Ravenclaw fragment of soul was burned out of the world. Crabbe was killed by his own spell. Harry and Ron and Hermione went into the Chamber of Secrets in the middle of the night, where Ron, with surprising linguistic ingenuity, hissed an approximation of Parseltongue from memory to open the sink, and they collected basilisk fangs from the skeleton of the dead serpent in the chamber, and Hermione destroyed the cup of Hufflepuff with one of them in the small island of stone at the centre of the lake. The cup screamed and broke. 5 Horcruxes were gone, 2 remained. Snape was in the Shrieking Shack with Voldemort and Nagini. He was reporting the state of the battle. Voldemort had concluded in the last hour that the Elder Wand was not performing for him the way it should. He had taken the wand from Dumbledore's tomb a week earlier. It should have been answering to him. It was not. He had decided that the wand's allegiance was still tied to Dumbledore's killer, and that Snape, who had killed Dumbledore, was therefore the wand's true master, and that the wand would not be his until Snape was dead. He explained all of this to Snape with calm reasonableness, the way a master might explain a procedural decision to a senior employee. Then he asked Nagini to kill him. Nagini struck. Snape fell, bleeding heavily, beside the wooden floor of the shack. Voldemort and the snake left. Harry, who had been hiding under the cloak in the next room, came in. He knelt beside Snape. Snape, with his last conscious moments, told Harry to take it, meaning the tears and other fluid running down his face and from his temples. He was producing memories. He was giving them up. Hermione produced a small flask. They filled it. Snape, the last words he ever spoke, told Harry to look at him. Harry looked. The black eyes met the green ones, the eyes Snape had loved when they had belonged to Harry's mother. Snape died. Harry took the flask to the headmaster's office, climbed the spiral staircase, and emptied the contents into the pensieve. He went down into the memories. He saw Snape's life in roughly 3 hours of compressed playback. The friendship with Lily Evans, the cruel break of that friendship, the Death Eater years, the day Snape had heard the prophecy, the day he had begged Dumbledore for Lily's life, the double agent years, the years at Hogwarts watching Harry grow up, the conversation in which Dumbledore had told Snape that Harry would have to die, because Harry was the 7th Horcrux, the one Voldemort had never meant to make, the bird in the cage, the plan that required Voldemort to kill Harry himself with the Master Wand so that the fragment of soul inside the scar would be destroyed without taking Harry's own soul with it. The whole long, quiet plan that had been running, underneath everything, for 16 years. Harry came out of the pensieve. He understood, finally, what had been asked of him. He left the office. He walked down the spiral staircase and down through the castle and out into the grounds. He walked across the lawn. Anne. He opened the snitch his father had given him for that Quidditch match in his first year, which Dumbledore had bequeathed to him at the end of the 6th year, which had borne the inscription "I open" at the close, which only opened now that Harry had accepted what was about to happen. Inside the snitch was the small black stone of the Gaunts' ring, the resurrection stone, set free at last from the Horcrux it had been bound to. Harry turned the stone 3 times in his hand. Around him, in the dark, the shades of his parents, his godfather, and his old teacher rose. They walked beside him. They did not feel cold. They felt like the people they had been. Anne. They walked with him through the forest until he reached the clearing where Voldemort had been waiting for the past hour with a circle of Death Eaters around him. Harry let the stone fall into the leaves. The shade sign faded. He stepped into the clearing and revealed himself. Voldemort stood up. He raised the Elder Wand. He spoke the killing curse for perhaps the 700th time in his life. The green light struck Harry on the forehead at the scar. Harry fell. He did not die. The soul fragment in his forehead died. The piece of Voldemort that had lived inside him for 16 years was severed and burned away by the curse. Harry, whose blood now flowed in Voldemort's reconstructed body, who shared the residue of the original blood protection his mother had built into him, was anchored to life by Voldemort himself. He did not pass on. He went, instead, briefly, to a quiet, bright station that resembled in his perception the platform at King's Cross, where the conductor was Albus Dumbledore. They sat on a bench together for what felt like a long time. Dumbledore explained what had happened. He explained the Hallows. He explained that Harry had a choice. He could come on, or he could go back. Harry chose to go back. He woke in the clearing. Voldemort was on the ground, unconscious for a moment, knocked off his feet by the rebound of his own curse. The Death Eaters around him were panicking. Narcissa Malfoy bent down to check whether Harry was dead. She felt the rise of his chest under his ribs. She looked up at Voldemort and lied. She said the boy was dead. She did this because she did more than anything else in that moment, to be allowed back into the castle to find her son Draco, who she did not know was alive. Voldemort believed her. He stood up. He had Hagrid, who had been captured during the battle, carry the supposedly dead boy back to the castle to show the defenders. Anne. The Death Eaters marched in formation back across the lawn. The defenders met them at the front of the castle. McGonagall screamed. Ginny Weasley screamed. Voldemort gloated for the better part of a minute. He told the defenders to surrender. He told them their hero was dead and resistance was pointless. Neville Longbottom, who had stepped forward out of the crowd, refused. He gave a small, fierce speech about Harry's death meaning nothing. He pulled the sword of Gryffindor out of the sorting hat that Voldemort, in mockery, had jammed onto his head. He swung the sword down. He took off Nagini's head at the throat. The last Horcrux but for Voldemort's own body was gone. The battle erupted around them again. The defenders flooded out of the castle. The Death Eaters scattered. Harry, under the cloak, slipped off Hagrid's back and disappeared. The fighting moved into the Great Hall. It became a manicided melee. Molly Weasley fought Bellatrix Lestrange in single combat by one of the long tables and killed her with a curse to the chest. Voldemort, in the center of the hall, was dueling 3 opponents at once when Harry threw off the cloak and revealed himself, alive, in front of the full hall. The room went quiet. They circled each other. Harry talked. He told Voldemort that the wand he was holding would not work. He told him that Snape had not been the master of the Elder Wand. The master of the wand had been Draco Malfoy, who had disarmed Dumbledore on the tower a year before, and the wand had been Draco's ever since. He told him that he, Harry, had disarmed Draco at Malfoy Manor several weeks earlier, and the wand was now answering to him. Voldemort did not believe it. The Elder Wand had served him perfectly in killing Snape, in striking down Harry in the clearing. It would serve him now. He cast the killing curse one more time, at the boy across the floor. Harry cast Expelliarmus. The yellow light met the green. Anne. They held against each other for a moment, the way they had once held in the cemetery at Little Hangleton. Then, the Elder Wand, recognizing its true master across the marble floor of the Great Hall, jumped out of Voldemort's hand. The killing curse that he had cast came back along the line of the spells and struck him in the chest. The most powerful dark wizard of the 20th century fell, as he had once fallen, on the upper floor of a cottage in the West Country 16 years before. He hit the flagstones of the Great Hall. His body this time was complete. His soul this time had no Horcrux left in the world to anchor it. The piece of him that had still inhabited his body for the past 3 years left the body at the moment of death and went looking for something to settle into, and found nothing, because no Horcruxes remained, and was pulled inexorably onward into whatever lies beyond. Tom Marvolo Riddle, born at Wool's Orphanage on the 31st of December, 1926, was dead. The Elder Wand spun across the floor. Harry caught it. It was just before dawn on the 2nd of May, 1998. The aftermath of the battle was not, in the strict sense, the end of the story. The wizarding world had been broken in ways that would take a long time to put right. There were funerals for weeks. The Great Hall was used as a hospital, and then as a mortuary, and then as a hall again, in that order, over the course of the next month. Anne. The students who had fought went home to their parents. If their parents were still alive and the orphaned ones were taken in by relatives, or by order members, or by the staff at Hogwarts itself, who arranged for them as best they could. The Wizengamot tried Death Eaters through the rest of the year. The ministry rebuilt itself slowly, with Kingsley Shacklebolt as the interim minister for magic, and gradually returned to functional operation. Hogwarts reopened in September with a temporary timetable and a great many empty seats at the longhouse tables. Harry, Ron, and Hermione did not go back for their 7th year at school. They had not finished 6th year either, technically, but the school awarded them their qualifications by special arrangement. Harry went into the Auror office. Ron went with him, after some months helping his brother George at the joke shop. Hermione went into the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, where over the years she worked her way to senior positions and eventually rewrote a great deal of the wizarding law around the rights of magical creatures, particularly house elves. Anne. They married, eventually, the people they had loved through the worst of it. Ginny became a professional Quidditch player, and then a sports journalist. Neville became a herbology professor at Hogwarts. Luna Lovegood became a magizoologist and travelled. They had children. The children grew up. The children went to Hogwarts. Tom Riddle had no children. He had never wanted any, in the conventional sense. He had wanted, instead, to live forever in his own body. He had ended up the opposite of what he had built himself to be. The man whose own name had meant flight from death had been killed by his own curse, by his own miscalculation about wand ownership, in front of 1,000 witnesses, on the floor of the school he had loved more than any other place in his life. Anne. His body was not buried in the great cemetery on the school grounds where the wizarding heroes of the battle were laid to rest. It was taken away by ministry workers in the morning, in a covered stretcher, and quietly cremated in a small ceremony. Dumbledore's portrait had quietly approved. His ashes were not memorialized. There was no monument. The wizarding world wanted very much to forget him, and so it largely did. The Horcruxes were all destroyed by the time the battle ended. The diary by Harry in the chamber. The ring by Dumbledore at the shack. The locket by Ron in the forest. The cup by Hermione in the chamber. The diadem by Crabbe's Fiendfire in the room of requirement. The serpent by Neville on the lawn. The piece that had lived in Harry's scar by Voldemort himself in the clearing. 7 fragments of soul, every one of them undone in the same long year. What remained of Tom Riddle's soul, after all of that, was a small broken piece, the size of a child, the kind that exists in the corner of a King's Cross-like station, weeping under a bench, unable to move on and unable to go back. Harry had seen it there. He had not been able to help it. Dumbledore had said gently that nothing could be done for it. It was beyond the reach of any kindness. It would simply be there, and then in time it would not. The wizarding world's recovery was the slow, ordinary work of recovery everywhere. The hatred between the old pureblood families and the muggle-born ones did not vanish, although it softened. The ministry stopped using the word mudblood in its internal communications and began, eventually, to mean it. The Dementors were withdrawn from Azkaban entirely and replaced with human auras, which was a debate the wizarding world had been having since the 1860s and which the Second War had finally settled. Werewolf rights legislation passed for the first time in 1999, largely because Remus Lupin had been one of the heroes of the battle, and his name carried sufficient weight to make the bill politically possible. Hogwarts was rebuilt. The walls were stone again. The ceiling of the Great Hall, which had been damaged in the fighting, was repaired by Phileas Flitwick personally, working late through several summer nights. The new generation of students came in. The houses still sorted themselves the old way. Slytherin still had its own table at the feasts. The portrait of Severus Snape, which Harry had insisted be hung in the headmaster's office despite the strong objections of the ministry, settled into its frame next to Dumbledore's, and the two of them spent a great many decades arguing in that office, quietly, about strategy and regret. The sleep that comes at the end of a long story is a kind of rest the body recognizes even when the mind does not. We have followed Tom Riddle from a back room of an orphanage in 1926 to the flagstones of a great hall in 1998. We have followed him through 70-ton years of decisions, almost every one of them his own, almost every one of them made out of fear of the same single ending. He could have lived a different life, Anne. He could have been the most accomplished wizard of his century in any of a dozen ways that did not require him to split his soul. He could have taught at the school he loved, Anne. He could have written the books that the careful, brilliant student inside him had always intended to write. He could have been remembered for any of these things. He chose instead to be remembered for nothing. He has, in the strange way that ironic outcomes find their targets, gotten exactly what he asked for. He is not remembered. His ashes are not labelled. The boy who carried his name is the one carved into the marble in the courtyard at Hogwarts, and the boy who killed him is the one whose photograph is in the wizarding history textbooks the new students open every September. The night is dark, the fire is low. There are owls calling on the grounds outside the castle. There are stars over the hills above the lock. The headmaster's portrait in his office is sleeping, and the swords in the trophy room are sleeping, and the children in the dormitories are sleeping, and in a small London street, the orphanage where Tom Riddle began. His life is now a block of flats, and the family living on the top floor have a small white dog who is, at this moment, asleep at the foot of the bed of a child who has never heard the name Voldemort, and never needs to. Sleep well. The story is finished. The night is yours.